The gates were iron, black as coal and twice as cold, and they did not open for women like Evelyn Hartwell. She had been standing at them for nearly 10 minutes, her fingers wrapped around the bars because her legs had stopped being entirely reliable somewhere around the third mile of walking. The November wind came down off the Rockies with nothing in its way, and it found every gap in her coat. The torn seam under her left arm, the missing button at the collar, the place on her right cuff where the fabric had worn so thin it was barely fabric anymore. She was 31 years old, and she suspected, considerably older than that. Behind the gates, the Blackstone Ranch spread out across the valley like something from a painting that celebrated wealth. The main house was 2 stories of dark timber and pale stone, its windows lit orange against the gray afternoon sky. Cattle moved in the far pastures, unhurried and fat. Smoke rose from 3 separate chimneys. To the east, a long stable block ran parallel to a row of cottonwood trees that had gone bare for winter, their branches reaching up like the fingers of men trying to surrender. Evelyn had heard about Blackstone Ranch in the town of Harrow Creek, 7 miles back. She'd heard about it in the way that people in small frontier towns speak about local power, with a mixture of pride and wariness, the way you'd talk about a river that could flood. Wade Blackstone owned 1,200 acres and ran nearly 400 head of cattle. He employed 11 men year-round, more during Roundup. His wife had died 3 years ago. He had 2 daughters. She had heard all of this while sitting in the corner of a general store, nursing a cup of coffee that a sympathetic shop girl had given her for free because Evelyn's hands were shaking too hard to count out coins. She'd eaten half a cold biscuit she'd found wrapped in paper at the bottom of her traveling bag and tried to calculate how long she could keep walking before her body simply refused to cooperate. The answer had not been encouraging. Blackstone Ranch was hiring, someone had said, not sure what for. Could be kitchen work, could be something with the children. That was all she'd needed. Now she stood at the iron gates, and a ranch hand was looking at her from the other side with an expression she recognized. It was the expression men wore when they'd already made up their minds but were deciding how rude to be about it. He was young, mid-20s, with a jaw that hadn't fully grown into his face yet, and hands that were already roughened beyond his years. He had his thumbs hooked in his belt, and he was not moving toward the gate latch. "Ranch isn't taking visitors," he said. "You need to move along." "I'm not a visitor." Evelyn kept her voice steady. She had practice at that. "I heard there might be work available. I'd like to speak with Mr. Blackstone." The young hand looked her over with the particular thoroughness of someone cataloging damage. Her coat, her boots, which were cracked along the left sole and had been stuffed with folded newspaper to keep the cold out, though the newspaper had gotten damp 3 days ago and stopped working. Her hair, which she'd pinned up that morning with the 2 pins she had left. But the wind had made its own decisions about that. "Mr. Blackstone doesn't take meetings at the gate," the hand said, "and the ranch isn't hiring women for ranch work." "I'm not asking for ranch work." Evelyn loosened her grip on the bars. Her fingers were stiff. "I heard he has daughters. I can cook, clean, sew, and I've kept children before. I'm asking for 5 minutes of his time." "5 minutes of his time costs more than you've got," the young man said, and there was something almost cheerful about the way he said it, the way young men can be cheerful about cruelty when they've got an audience of nobody. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked past him at the main house, at those warm orange windows. "Will you at least tell him someone came?" she asked. "That's all. Just tell him." The young hand appeared to consider this. "I'll tell him," he said, in a tone that made clear he would do no such thing. "Now move along before the cold gets you." He turned and walked back toward the stable block. Evelyn did not move along. She stood at the gate because she had nowhere to move along to. She'd been in Colorado for 6 weeks, drifting southeast from Wyoming, picking up what work she could find, which had not been much. Before Wyoming, there had been Nebraska, where she'd spent 4 months trying to hold together what was left of her life after Thomas died. And before that, there had been Kansas. And before Kansas, there had been a homestead in eastern Iowa that she'd shared with her husband and her daughter, and that had burned to the ground in July of 1883. She did not let herself think about Iowa. There were things the mind had to put in a room and lock the door on, and Iowa was one of those things. The cold was getting worse. She'd been right about that. The young hand had been right about that anyway. The wind picked up and found the tear under her arm again, and she pressed her elbow against it uselessly. She was considering sitting down on the ground, which would be undignified but would at least get her out of the wind when she heard boots on the gravel path behind the gate. Not the young hand's boots. Different weight to them. More deliberate. Wade Blackstone was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said exactly what she had expected. He was perhaps 40, perhaps a few years past it, with dark hair going gray at the temples and a face that had been outdoors for most of those 40 years. He was dressed plainly for a man of his means. Work trousers, a heavy canvas coat, boots that were good quality but worn. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, and he moved with the slightly contained quality of a man who has learned not to take up too much space indoors. He stopped about 8 feet from the gate and looked at her. Evelyn straightened her spine. She was aware of what she looked like. She'd seen herself in a window reflection 2 days ago and had wished she hadn't, but she held her chin level and met his eyes, which were dark brown, and at that particular moment were unreadable. Tommy said a woman was at the gate asking for work, Wade Blackstone said. His voice was lower than she'd expected. He didn't say you'd still be here. He told me to move along, Evelyn said. I didn't have anywhere to move along to. Something shifted in his face. Not pity. She would have recognized pity, and she'd learned to hate it. It was something else, something more like attention. Where'd you come from? He asked. Most recently? Harrow Creek. Before that, Cañon City. Before that, Pueblo. You've been walking all this way? Mostly. I had a horse until Cañon City. She didn't elaborate. The horse had gone toward a debt she couldn't pay any other way. Wade Blackstone looked at her for another moment. Then he looked over his shoulder at the main house, and whatever he was thinking, he kept it to himself. What kind of work are you asking for? He said. I heard you have daughters. She kept her voice even, practical. She needed to sound practical, not desperate, even though she was both. I can cook. I'm a good cook, actually. I can do more than basics. I can clean and manage a house. I can sew and mend. I've looked after children before, and I'm patient with them. I'm not asking for charity. I'm asking for a chance to earn my keep. How old are you? 31. You have family somewhere? No. He looked at her steadily. What happened to your husband? It was a blunt question, and she supposed she deserved it, or at least expected it. Women alone on the frontier were always either widowed or ruined, and the distinction mattered to people. He died, she said, 18 months ago. Fever. Wade Blackstone nodded slowly. He was quiet for what felt like a long time. The wind moved through the cottonwood branches and made a dry, rattling sound. From somewhere inside the stable block, a horse stamped and blew. I've had 3 women try this ranch in the past 2 years, he said finally, looking after the girls, managing the house. First one lasted 4 months before she decided ranch life wasn't for her. Second one I had to let go because she was stealing small things, silverware mostly, I don't know why silverware, and thought I wouldn't notice. Third one was kind enough, but the girls made her life miserable, and she left crying. Evelyn held still. My daughters are not easy, he continued. Abigail is 13 and she has opinions. Lucy is 9, and she has decided, somewhere in the past 3 years, that the way to survive losing her mother is to trust nobody new. I say this not to frighten you off. I say it because I've spent 2 years watching women walk back out through those gates, and I've got no patience for pretense. I appreciate the honesty, Evelyn said. I'm not done. He wasn't harsh about it, just direct. What I offer is room and board, meals, and fair wages, $5 a month. Not generous, I know. If you prove yourself worth more, it goes up. If at 3 months I'm not satisfied or you're not satisfied, we part ways without rancor. He paused. You look like you haven't eaten a real meal in some time. Evelyn said nothing, because anything she said would have been either a lie or a confession she wasn't ready to make. That's not a criticism, he added, more quietly. It's an observation. She looked at him. Are you offering me work, Mr. Blackstone? He looked back at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and unlatched the gate. I'm offering you supper and a night indoors, he said. We'll see about the rest in the morning. The kitchen at Blackstone Ranch was the largest room Evelyn had been inside in over a year. It ran along the back of the house, with a cast-iron stove that was still warm from the evening meal, and a long wooden table scarred with years of use. Copper pots hung from a ceiling rack. There was a real ice box, which still astonished her. Ice brought down from somewhere and kept through the season. A window above the sink looked out onto the backyard where a pump and a garden stood frozen and empty for winter. A woman named Rosa, who was perhaps 50, and had the kind of silence around her that suggested she'd been managing other people's households for a very long time, had brought Evelyn into the kitchen while Wade dealt with something in the yard. Rosa set a bowl of beef stew on the table without commentary and a heel of bread beside it and a cup of coffee, and then retreated to the far end of the kitchen to do something with a pot. Evelyn ate the way she hadn't allowed herself to eat in public for weeks, carefully, but all of it. Every drop of the stew. The entire heel of bread. The coffee, which was strong enough to make her eyes water and which she was grateful for down to her bones. She was mopping the last of the stew with the bread crust when she became aware that she was being watched. She looked up slowly. 2 girls stood in the kitchen doorway. The older one, Abigail, 13, had her father's coloring and her father's stillness, and she was looking at Evelyn with an expression that managed to combine complete assessment with complete withholding of judgment, which was a complicated thing to manage at 13. She had her arms folded. She was not hostile exactly. She was waiting to be hostile, which was different. The younger one, Lucy, was smaller than Evelyn expected for 9. She stood slightly behind her sister with her hands gripping the doorframe at hip height, and she was staring at Evelyn with large brown eyes that gave away more than her sister's did. She was afraid, though it was not immediately clear of what. Evelyn set down her bread crust. "Evening," she said. Neither girl responded immediately. Then Abigail said, "You're the one Papa let in at the gate." "That's right. Tommy said you wouldn't leave." "Tommy told me to move along. I didn't have a direction." Abigail considered this. "Where were you going before you came here?" "Nowhere specific. I was looking for work." "What kind?" "Whatever I could find. I was hoping for something with cooking or housekeeping, or children." At the word children, Lucy's grip on the doorframe tightened slightly. Evelyn noticed it and did not comment on it. "We had a woman who did cooking and housekeeping," Abigail said. "Mrs. Pembroke. She left in August. I heard there might be a position open. She cried when she left." Abigail said this without particular cruelty, more as information. "Lucy made her cry." "Abby," Lucy said, quiet and sharp, from behind her sister's shoulder. "It's true." "I know it's true. You don't have to say it to her." Abigail unfolded her arms and refolded them differently, which seemed to indicate a shift in her thinking. "Can you actually cook?" she asked. "Or is that just what you said to get inside?" "I can cook," Evelyn said. "I cooked for my husband for 6 years, and before that I helped run a boarding house kitchen in Ohio." "What did you cook in the boarding house?" It was such an unexpectedly practical question that Evelyn almost smiled. "Breakfast for 20 mostly. Oatmeal, eggs, bacon when we had it, biscuits. Lunch was simpler. Soups, cold meats. Dinner was more pot roasts, stews, beans and ham, pies on Sundays if we could manage it." "What kind of pies?" "Apple was most common. Peach in summer. Rhubarb in spring. I do a good raisin custard." Lucy moved slightly out from behind her sister. "Not much, but some." "Mrs. Pembroke couldn't make pie crust," Abigail said, with the particular gravity of someone reporting a fundamental failure of character. "It always got too tough." "Pie crust is about not overworking the dough," Evelyn said, "and cold butter. Most people make the mistake of getting it too warm." Abigail looked at her sister. Something passed between them that Evelyn couldn't read. "You can sleep in Mrs. Pembroke's room," Abigail said finally, as if she were making this decision herself. "It's at the end of the hall upstairs. It has a window, but the latch is broken, so you have to wedge it with a piece of wood. Rosa will show you." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "I didn't say you could stay," Abigail added quickly. "That's Papa's decision. I'm just saying where you'd sleep if you did." "I understand the difference." Abigail studied her for another moment. Then she turned and disappeared from the doorway. Lucy lingered a second longer, her hands still on the frame, looking at Evelyn with those dark, cautious eyes. "Mrs. Pembroke smelled like lavender water," Lucy said very quietly. "You smell like cold." "I've been outside for a while," Evelyn said. Lucy nodded very seriously, as if this explained something important. Then she followed her sister. The room at the end of the hall was small and cold, and the most private space Evelyn had occupied in over a year. There was a narrow bed with a wool blanket and a second blanket folded at the foot, a dresser with 3 drawers, a washstand with a ceramic pitcher, and the window Abigail had mentioned, which Evelyn wedged shut with a scrap of wood she found on the sill, apparently left there by Mrs. Pembroke for precisely this purpose. She sat on the edge of the bed and held very still for a while. Outside, the wind was moving around the eaves of the house. Downstairs, she could hear the low sound of Wade Blackstone's voice speaking to Rosa, though she couldn't make out the words. From somewhere further along the hall, she could hear the quiet sounds of girls getting ready for bed. A door, a drawer, the particular shuffling silence of children who have learned to be quiet in their own house. She was aware, with the particular clarity that extreme hunger and cold can produce, of how precarious her position was. She had been offered supper and a night indoors. That was all. In the morning, a man she didn't know would make a decision about her future based on a 10-minute conversation at an iron gate and whatever Rosa told him about how she'd behaved in the kitchen. She thought about Thomas. She thought about him in the way she allowed herself to think about him, which was in controlled portions, like medicine you had to be careful not to take too much of. His hands. The specific way he'd laughed at his own jokes before the punchline. The fact that he'd known she was capable of more than she'd let herself believe, and had told her so, and had been right, though she hadn't wanted to test the theory under these circumstances. She didn't let herself think about Clara. She lay down on the narrow bed without undressing. Her other dress was in her bag and was barely better than the one she wore, and she'd need to be presentable in the morning, and pulled both blankets over herself and listened to the wind in the house settling around her and the distant sound of cattle, and thought about pie crust, cold butter, not overworking the dough. She was asleep before she finished the thought. Morning at Blackstone Ranch began before the sky was properly light. Evelyn woke to the sound of men's voices in the yard below her window and lay still for a moment, reorienting herself to the ceiling above her, which was real wood planks and not canvas or open sky. Then she got up, washed her face and hands at the washstand. The water in the pitcher had gone cold overnight, but that was nothing new, pinned her hair as neatly as she could manage with 2 pins, and went downstairs. Rosa was already in the kitchen. She looked at Evelyn with an expression that was not unfriendly but was not warm either, the expression of a woman who had seen hired help come and go and had learned not to invest too soon. "Coffee's ready," Rosa said. "Girls come down at 7. Mr. Blackstone eats with the hands at 5:30. But he'll come back to the house around 9 for the morning's paperwork." "What does breakfast usually look like for the girls?" Rosa looked at her with mild surprise, as if this were a more practical question than she'd expected. "Whatever's available. Oatmeal most mornings, eggs when we have enough. Lucy won't eat eggs if you cook them too hard. She says they taste like rubber. Abigail will eat anything, but she doesn't like to admit it." "Is there flour?" Evelyn asked. "Butter? Lard?" "In the pantry. Why?" "I thought I'd make biscuits." Rosa looked at her for a moment. Then something shifted in her face. Not quite approval, but the early consideration of it. "Pantry's through there," she said, nodding toward a door. The pantry was better stocked than she'd seen in months. Evelyn stood in the doorway for a moment, just taking it in. The sacks of flour and cornmeal, the jars of preserved vegetables lined up on shelves, the braided ropes of dried herbs, the crocks of lard, the smaller crocks of butter. She felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight for a very long time. She made biscuits. Good ones. Her mother's recipe. The one that required cold butter cut in quickly and a light hand and no more mixing than strictly necessary. She made a double batch because she'd noted, from the sounds of the house, that it was a household that used food. She made a pot of oatmeal, too, because you couldn't know how hungry growing children would be, and she put dried apples in it the way she'd liked it herself as a girl. Abigail appeared at 7:10, already dressed, her hair in a practical braid. She stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at the biscuits on the table and then at Evelyn. "You made those this morning?" she said. "About an hour ago." Abigail sat down without further comment and ate 2 biscuits with butter and a bowl of oatmeal and didn't say anything was wrong with any of it, which Evelyn took as a good sign. Lucy came down 7 minutes after her sister, barefoot despite the cold floors, her hair down and uncombed. She stood in the kitchen doorway looking at the table with an expression that was either suspicion or something very close to hope, and Evelyn could not immediately tell which. Sit down, Luce, Abigail said, without looking up from her oatmeal. She made biscuits. I can see that, Lucy said. She padded to the table and sat down and looked at Evelyn, who was standing by the stove with her coffee. They have dried apples in them? She said, meaning the oatmeal. They do. Lucy picked up her spoon and began to eat. After a moment, she said, Mrs. Pembroke put raisins in the oatmeal. I don't like raisins. Duly noted, Evelyn said. She put them in everything. I'll keep that in mind. Lucy ate 3/4 of her oatmeal and 1 biscuit and then pushed back from the table. I'm going to help Papa in the yard, she announced. You're supposed to do your lessons first, Abigail said. I'll do them after. That's what you said yesterday. Yesterday I did do them after. Lucy looked at Evelyn with a kind of assessing frankness that children sometimes have before they learn to be subtle about it. Are you going to be here tomorrow? I hope so, Evelyn said honestly. Do you know how to do sums? I do. Hard ones? Fairly hard ones. Lucy considered this. Then she went out to find her father. Wade Blackstone came back to the house at 9:30 with mud on his boots, and a look on his face that suggested the morning had offered at least one unpleasant surprise. He came through the back door into the kitchen and stopped when he saw the pan of remaining biscuits on the table. Rosa was at the sink. She glanced at him and then went back to what she was doing. Rosa make these? Wade asked. No. Rosa did not turn around. She did. He looked at Evelyn, who was at the table working on a tear in one of Lucy's dresses that she'd found draped over the back of a chair. She had a needle and thread from the small sewing kit she kept in her traveling bag, because you didn't survive on the road without one. Girls eat? He asked. Yes, they both ate well. Lucy went to find you in the yard. Found me, he said, with something in his voice that might have been, if she was reading it right, a small and private warmth. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and reached for a biscuit. He ate it in silence. Evelyn kept her eyes on the mending. You cook like this every morning where you worked before? He asked. When supplies allowed. This pantry's better stocked than anything I've worked with in a while, so. He was quiet again. She could feel him thinking, though he was the sort of man who thought quietly. I'm going to be direct with you, he said. I'd prefer that. I don't know you. I know nothing about you beyond what you told me at the gate yesterday. You could be anyone. That's true, she said, not looking up. I have 2 daughters in this house. I understand that. Abigail told me this morning that you explained the cold butter method for pie crust. A pause. That's exactly what my mother used to say. Evelyn looked up from the mending. Wade Blackstone was looking at her with the same unreadable quality he'd had at the gate, but there was something underneath it now. Something more tired and more honest. I lost my wife 3 years ago, he said. January of '82. Fever, same as your husband, though it was faster for Eleanor. 3 days from sick to gone. He set down the half-eaten biscuit. The girls don't talk about it much. Lucy doesn't really remember, which is its own kind of hard thing. Abigail remembers everything, and she holds it in so tight I worry about what happens when she finally doesn't. Evelyn was quiet. I'm not looking for someone to replace Eleanor, he said, and there was a firmness to it that suggested this was something he'd said before or said to himself. I'm looking for someone who can help this house function and keep my daughters from growing up without anyone to talk to except ranch hands and each other. He picked up his biscuit again. The wages I offered stand. 3-month trial. You cook, manage the house, help with lessons when they'll sit for them. Rosa handles the heavy laundry, and she knows this place better than I do, so don't try to reorganize anything without asking her first. Understood. You'll have Sundays to yourself after noon, unless there's something that can't wait. That's fair? He stood up. Good. I'll have Tommy bring your bag in from wherever it ended up. He said Tommy's name without particular emphasis, but there was a slight edge to it that suggested Tommy's oversight the previous day had not gone unremarked upon. He moved toward the door that led into the rest of the house, then paused with his hand on the frame. The dress you're mending, he said, that's Lucy's. I noticed it needed attention. She's hard on her clothes. Children usually are. He nodded, almost to himself. Then he said without turning around, you mentioned you'd kept children before, back at the gate. Evelyn kept her eyes on the mending. Her needle moved in and out of the fabric steadily. Yes, she said. He didn't ask anything further. Maybe he heard something in the single word that told him not to. He went through the door, and his boots moved away down the hall. Evelyn sat for a moment with the mending in her lap and the needle still. Then she took a slow breath and kept going. The first week was not easy, and she hadn't expected it to be. Lucy was a puzzle, affectionate in flashes, and then suddenly gone cold, like a fire that couldn't make up its mind. She'd sit beside Evelyn at the kitchen table while Evelyn cooked and ask rapid, scattered questions about Ohio, about the boarding house, about what Denver was like, about whether it was true that the Pacific Ocean was bigger than you could see across. And then, the next morning, she'd appear at breakfast and say nothing at all and look at Evelyn as if she'd never made the decision to trust her. It wasn't cruelty. It was self-protection, and Evelyn recognized it because she'd seen it in herself after Thomas died, and before that, after Clara, after Iowa. She didn't finish the thought. Abigail was more consistent, which was both easier and harder. Consistent in her assessment, consistent in her skepticism, consistent in the way she watched Evelyn from across rooms, as if she were calculating something. She was not rude. She did her lessons without argument. She helped in the kitchen occasionally, efficiently and without complaint, and when Evelyn showed her how to cut butter into flour properly, quick, with the fingertips, don't let the warmth of your hands get into it. She paid close attention and got it right on the second attempt. But she did not let herself like Evelyn. Not yet. Evelyn could see her not letting herself, the small daily act of will that it required. On the fifth day, Evelyn burned a batch of cornbread. Not badly. It was still edible at the edges, but the center was too dark, and the whole kitchen smelled of it. She stood at the stove with the pan in her hands and said, quietly but distinctly, "Damn." From the kitchen doorway, Abigail said, "Mrs. Pembroke never said anything when she burned things. What did she do?" "She just served them and hoped nobody noticed." "Did anyone notice?" "Obviously." Evelyn set the pan on the cooling rack. "I burned it. I was thinking about something else and I left it too long. I'll make another batch." "That's wasteful." "It's more wasteful to serve bad food and have people know you're pretending it's acceptable." She reached for the flour. "Mistakes happen. The question is whether you try to hide them or whether you fix them." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "Papa says something like that. About the ranch." "Your father sounds like a sensible man." "He is." A pause. "Usually." "What does he do when he's not sensible?" Another pause, longer. Then, with something that was almost, just barely, the edge of a smile. "He sometimes lets strangers in the gate when Tommy isn't looking." Evelyn kept her eyes on the flour she was measuring. "Terrible habit," she said. And Abigail laughed, a short, surprised sound, as if she hadn't meant to and wasn't sure she approved of having done it. But it was real, and it was there, and it was the first completely real thing the girl had shown her. Evelyn mixed the new batter without looking up and gave the laugh room to exist, and didn't make anything of it. The trouble was already coming. She didn't know it yet. She wouldn't know it for another several weeks when the first signs would seem like coincidence, like small misfortunes, like the ordinary bad luck of a hard season. But it was coming in the shape of a man on a gray horse who had ridden past the Blackstone boundary line 3 times in the past 2 weeks, not close enough to cause a confrontation, just close enough to be seen. Victor Hale. She didn't know his name yet. She didn't know that he'd been circling Blackstone Ranch for 2 years, like a wolf circling a fire, waiting for the moment the fire got low enough to approach. She didn't know that his interest in the property ran to almost $20,000 of private calculation, and that in those calculations Wade Blackstone was an obstacle, and a woman who had appeared from nowhere to stabilize the Blackstone household was a problem he had not accounted for. She didn't know any of this. She was making the second batch of cornbread and listening to the sound of Lucy's footsteps on the porch outside. Running, she noted, always running, and thinking about whether a raisin custard pie might be the right thing for Sunday, and whether Abigail would be pleased or would make a point of not being pleased. Outside in the gray Colorado afternoon, the man on the gray horse sat at the boundary line a long time before he turned and rode south. The fire was still burning, but he was a patient man. He could wait. The raisin custard pie was a success, which Evelyn had not entirely counted on. She'd made it Sunday afternoon with Lucy sitting on the kitchen stool beside her, watching the process with the focused intensity of a child who is pretending to be merely curious when in fact she is memorizing everything. Evelyn talked through each step without being asked. The crust, the filling, the way you knew the custard was right by how it moved when you tilted the pan. And Lucy asked exactly 3 questions, all of them practical, none of them about anything other than the pie itself. When it came out of the oven and Evelyn set it on the rack to cool, Lucy leaned forward and breathed in slowly. "Mrs. Pembroke made apple cake once," she said. "Was it good?" "It was dry." A pause. "She tried very hard, though. She looked like she wanted us to like it." That's an honest assessment. "Abigail said we should tell her it was wonderful, because she'd worked hard." Evelyn covered the pie with a cloth. "And did you?" Lucy was quiet for a moment. "I said it was very nice. That wasn't a lie, exactly. It was nice that she made it." Evelyn turned to look at the girl, who was picking at a loose thread on her sleeve with total concentration. She'd learned in the past week that Lucy did this when she was working through something that mattered to her. The sleeve of that particular dress had lost 2 inches of hem so far. "You don't like lying," Evelyn said. "Abigail says sometimes it's kinder. Your sister's not wrong, but it doesn't feel right." Lucy looked up. "Does it feel right to you?" Evelyn thought about this honestly, which Lucy somehow always managed to compel her to do. "It depends on the lie," she said. "There are lies that protect people and lies that protect yourself, and they're not the same thing." Lucy turned this over. "Which kind was telling Mrs. Pembroke the cake was nice?" "The first kind, I think." "Then why did it feel like the second kind?" Evelyn had no good answer to that, and she said so. And Lucy accepted this with the gravity of someone who has learned that adults not having answers is just a feature of the world, and not a failure specific to this adult. The pie, when they cut it after supper, was good. Evelyn knew it was good while she was making it. You develop a sense for these things. But there was still a particular satisfaction in watching it hold its shape when sliced. The custard set properly, the crust flaking the way it should. Wade took a piece and ate half of it before he said anything, which was its own kind of compliment. "Eleanor used to make something like this," he said, not to anyone in particular, looking at his plate. The table went briefly quiet. Abigail looked at her father. Lucy went very still. Evelyn said nothing. There were moments that didn't need filling. Wade looked up and caught her eye. And there was something in his face, not grief exactly, or not only grief, that she didn't quite know how to categorize. He looked back down at his plate. "It's very good," he said. "Thank you." "You're welcome," Evelyn said, and passed the remaining custard to Abigail, who took a second slice without being asked, and acted as if she hadn't. December settled in hard and early. The temperature dropped below freezing most nights, and the mountain passes to the west closed with the first heavy snowfall, cutting Harrow Creek off from the bigger towns until spring thaw made the roads passable again. The ranch became its own world in the way frontier properties did in winter. Self-contained, inward-facing, dependent on what had been put up and stored and prepared in the months before. Evelyn found her footing in the work. She had always been good at the physical logic of a household, the sequencing of tasks, the way you could get 3 things done at once if you thought about them correctly, the particular satisfaction of a pantry organized by use rather than size. Rosa watched her without comment for 2 weeks, and then one morning began telling her things without being asked. Where the extra lamp oil was kept, which hinge on the cellar door needed lifting to open properly, the fact that the east pump froze before the west one and needed to be brought in on hard nights. It was, Evelyn understood, the most trust Rosa was likely to extend in a short period of time, and she received it accordingly. The girls' lessons were a different project. The county had no school teacher within reasonable distance, and hadn't for over a year since the previous one had left for California. So Wade had been conducting their education himself on evenings when the ranch work permitted, which was inconsistent at best. Abigail, who had inherited something of her father's self-discipline, had kept up with reading and mathematics on her own. Lucy had largely stopped cooperating with the endeavor sometime around September and had developed a set of creative objections to every lesson proposed. Evelyn didn't approach it as lessons. She approached it as conversation with a secondary purpose. She read to them in the evenings. She'd found 3 books on a shelf in the front parlor, one of them a battered collection of short stories, one a natural history of North America with detailed illustrations that Lucy spent hours with, one a novel she was less certain about but tried a chapter of anyway. She talked through arithmetic in practical terms, baking proportions, the acreage calculations she'd overheard Wade discussing, the cost of supplies when they'd made a list for the spring resupply order. Lucy, it turned out, was faster at sums than she let on. She'd been refusing to do them because she'd decided she didn't like the workbook she'd been given, not because she couldn't. "You knew how to do these the whole time?" Evelyn asked, after Lucy had worked out 3 consecutive problems in her head before Evelyn had finished copying them down. Lucy shrugged, which was its own answer. "Then why—" "The workbook has Mr. Harrison's handwriting in the margins," Lucy said, "from the school teacher before. He had bad handwriting. It bothered me." Evelyn looked at the workbook. There were indeed notes in a cramped and somewhat chaotic hand throughout the margins. She understood, she thought, more than she might have a week ago, what it meant to have a reason for avoiding something that seemed unreasonable from the outside but was entirely real from the inside. "What if we used a different book?" she said. Lucy considered. "What book?" "We'd have to make one. Copy the problems into a clean notebook." "That's a lot of work." "I know. For you, I mean. You'd have to write all of them." "I'm aware." Lucy looked at her with that steady, evaluating gaze. "You'd do that?" "If it means you'll actually do the work and stop pretending you can't." Another pause. Then, "Can I pick the notebook?" "Within reason." They found a blank notebook in the desk in the front parlor, green-covered and barely used, and Evelyn spent an evening transcribing arithmetic problems while Lucy sat beside her and watched and occasionally pointed out which ones were too easy to bother with. It was tedious work, and Evelyn's hand cramped around the 3rd page, and she said so. And Lucy, without comment, took the pencil and copied the next 2 problems herself. It wasn't a breakthrough. It was just a girl deciding that one particular adult was worth a small effort. But Evelyn had learned in the months since Thomas died, and the world had become a series of daily negotiations with a reality that was not cooperating, that small efforts were the material of most things. What? Abigail's opening came differently. The way things came differently with older children who've had time to build their defenses higher and stack them in more complicated patterns. It was the 3rd week of December, a Tuesday, and the temperature had dropped to something brutal overnight. Evelyn came down before dawn to build the kitchen fire back up and found Abigail already there, sitting at the table in her coat with her arms around herself and a look on her face that she quickly rearranged when Evelyn came through the door. But Evelyn had seen it. A split second of something completely unguarded. Not the careful, watchful Abigail who managed everything from behind glass, but a different girl. One who was cold and tired and possibly had been crying, though her face now said nothing of the sort. Evelyn went to the stove and began building the fire. She didn't say anything about what she'd seen. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, conversationally, feeding kindling into the firebox. "I woke up," Abigail said. "The wind was loud." "It was. I heard it too." A pause. The fire caught. Evelyn set the kettle on. "I had a dream," Abigail said after a moment. She said it toward the table, not toward Evelyn. "About my mother." Evelyn said nothing, which was the right thing. "I don't have them very often anymore," Abigail continued. "I used to right after, almost every night, but now it's maybe, I don't know, not often." She paused. "In this one, she was just in the kitchen. She wasn't doing anything particular. She was just there." "Those can be the hardest kind," Evelyn said. Abigail looked up at her. "Why?" "Because you wake up and the absence is fresh again. Dreams where something is wrong or frightening at least prepare you for the feeling when you open your eyes. But a dream that's just ordinary, the person just being there." She stopped. "Those take a moment." Abigail was quiet, watching her. "Did you dream about your husband?" "In the beginning, yes." "Does it go away?" Evelyn took a careful breath. She thought about Thomas. She thought about what was honest versus what was comforting, and she thought about what she'd told Lucy, that there were lies that protected people and lies that protected yourself. "It changes," she said. "It doesn't go away exactly, but the feeling when you wake up, the shock of it, that gets shorter. The dream starts feeling more like a visit and less like a wound." Abigail absorbed this. The kettle was beginning to murmur. "Mama used to get up early," she said. "She'd be in the kitchen when I came down sometimes. She'd have coffee and she'd be reading something. She liked to read in the morning before everyone else was up. A pause. She said it was the only quiet time. Smart woman. She was. The word had an edge to it, not of bitterness, but of fierceness. The particular fierceness of someone protecting a memory from being diminished. She was very smart. Papa says I have her way of thinking. He means it as a compliment. It clearly is one. I know. Abigail unfolded her arms and laid them on the table. I didn't want a compliment. I wanted her. The kettle boiled. Evelyn poured 2 cups of coffee, which was presumptuous, and she set one in front of Abigail, who was 13 and probably didn't drink coffee, but who received it without comment and wrapped her hands around the cup. They sat at the table while the fire worked on the kitchen, and the dark outside the window began its slow concession to gray, and neither of them said anything for a while, which was exactly correct. When the light was strong enough to see by, Abigail said, "The window latch on your room still broken?" "Still broken." "Papa should fix that. I've been managing with the wood." "The piece that was there? That was from a ruler Lucy broke last spring. She threw it at the wall." A pause and something almost like amusement in Abigail's voice. She was very angry about fractions. "I see. She'd probably admit it now. Abigail stopped. "She likes you," she said finally, simply, as if this were both obvious and significant. "I like her," Evelyn said. She hasn't taken to someone new in a long time." Abigail looked at her coffee cup. "Not since Mama." Evelyn said nothing. "I'm not saying," Abigail started, then stopped again. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not saying I don't like you. I'm just—" "You're careful," Evelyn said. "That's not a flaw. That's sense." Abigail looked up at her. The guarded quality was still there, but there was something else underneath it now, something that was considering more actively than before, whether caution and openness could coexist. "Mrs. Pembroke cried when she left," she said again, as she had that first night. But this time it sounded different, less like information and more like a confession. "I was the one who made her cry. I said things I knew I said them on purpose." "I figured that," Evelyn said. Abigail blinked. "You figured it? You're a perceptive girl. Perceptive people usually know which words will land where. Whether they use that carefully or carelessly is a different question." Abigail looked at her steadily. "You're not like any of the other women Papa's hired," she said. "I'm not any of those women." "No." A pause. "I know that." She stood up, taking her coffee cup with her. "I need to get dressed. Lucy will sleep until noon if someone doesn't get her moving. I'll start breakfast." Abigail paused in the kitchen doorway. She looked back once, and there was something in her face that was not quite a smile and was not quite peace, but was something between the two, something that would need more time to resolve into one or the other. "She really does like your biscuits," she said. "For the record." "For the record," Evelyn said, "I know." Abigail left, and Evelyn let herself stand by the warm stove for just a moment, coffee in hand, and feel something she had almost forgotten the geography of. It took her a moment to recognize it. It was something close to belonging. Wade Blackstone was not a man who talked about himself easily. Evelyn had learned this by watching, which was how you learned most things about men of his type. Men whose communication was primarily through action, through the management of large practical problems, through the 1,000 daily decisions that running a place like Blackstone Ranch required. He was not cold. He was not unfriendly. He was simply a man who had gotten out of the habit of interior conversation and perhaps had never been deeply in it. But he was also not unobservant. He noticed things. He noticed that Lucy had started doing her arithmetic without being asked. He noticed that Abigail had begun setting the table without being reminded, which was apparently not something she'd done before. He noticed the state of the pantry and the mended curtain in the front parlor and the fact that Rosa, for the first time in months, had taken an afternoon off on a Wednesday because things were organized enough that she could. He didn't say most of what he noticed, but occasionally, in the evenings, he'd stop in the kitchen doorway on his way through to his study, and he'd say something brief, a question about how the day had gone, or a comment about the weather and what it meant for the stock, or sometimes just a report on whatever the morning's particular problem had been, offered up the way a person offers information to someone whose opinion they're beginning to consider relevant. Evelyn answered these offerings in kind, direct, practical, unsentimental. She didn't try to extend the conversations or steer them somewhere warmer. She let them be what they were. It was 2 days before Christmas when he stopped in the kitchen doorway to find her making something more complicated than usual. A layered cake, which she'd attempted because she'd found a recipe written in pencil on a piece of paper tucked inside one of the recipe books, in handwriting she assumed was Eleanor's. He stood in the doorway without speaking for long enough that Evelyn looked up. "Is that Eleanor's recipe book?" he asked. His voice was careful. "I found it on the pantry shelf. I should have asked first. I'm sorry." He shook his head. "No, I didn't know it was still there. I thought Rosa had—" "No." He came into the kitchen, which he didn't usually do in the evenings when Evelyn was working, and he stopped beside the counter and looked at the open page. His face did something complicated. "This is her ginger cake," he said. "She made it every Christmas Eve." Evelyn set down her spoon. "I can stop. I can make something else." "Don't." The word came out with more force than he'd intended, and he seemed to hear it. He stepped back slightly. "Please don't," he said, quieter. The girls would—" He stopped, tried again. "Lucy doesn't remember it. Abigail does. I think it would mean something." Evelyn looked at him for a moment. He was standing in the middle of his own kitchen looking slightly lost, which she suspected was not a state he permitted himself often or in front of many people. "Do you want to tell me if I'm doing it right?" she asked. "You probably know the recipe better than I do." Something shifted in his face. "She put more ginger than it says," he said. "She always said the recipe was timid." Evelyn picked up the ginger jar. "How much more?" "Almost double, I think." She measured twice what the recipe called for and looked at him. "About that," he said. "Maybe a little less." She adjusted. He stayed while she finished the batter, not exactly helping but present, answering questions about the oven heat and the right pan and whether Eleanor had always used that particular kind of molasses. It was the longest conversation they'd had about something other than the ranch or the girls, and it was about Eleanor mostly, which was not a subject Evelyn had expected to be admitted to. She didn't try to make it mean more than it was. He was a man who missed his wife, standing in the kitchen where his wife used to cook, helping a stranger recreate something familiar. That was what it was. She kept her hands on the work and her attention on the recipe and didn't try to reach for anything that wasn't being offered. But when she slid the pan into the oven and he said, "Thank you," that was something I didn't know I needed. She understood that the ground between them had shifted a degree, maybe 2 degrees, toward something that was not yet nameable, but was real. The man on the gray horse had a name, Victor Hale. She learned it from Rosa, offhandedly, the way you learned the names of local hazards, the drifts that formed on the north side of the ridge, the well that went bad in dry summers, the neighbor whose interests had been pointed at Blackstone land for 2 years. "He rides that boundary line," Rosa said, "because he wants Mr. Blackstone to see him, wants him to know he's watching." "What does he want with the ranch?" Rosa was folding laundry with the efficient movements of long practice. "Same thing men like him always want. More. The Blackstone land connects his northern and southern properties. If he had this section, he'd have the biggest single holding in this part of Colorado." She folded a shirt, sharp and precise. "He's made offers. Mr. Blackstone's refused them. After Mrs. Blackstone died, he made more offers. Said the ranch was too much for a man alone." Her expression said what she thought of this. "Mr. Blackstone refused those too. And now?" "Now Mr. Blackstone's got things running better than they have in 2 years, and Victor Hale's sitting on his land watching." Rosa set the folded shirt on the pile. "Men like that don't like watching." Evelyn thought about this later, working through its implications the way you work through a splinter you can feel but not quite reach. She'd encountered men like this before. Not the same scale, not the same money, but the same architecture inside them, the same inability to let a thing exist that they'd decided they wanted. Thomas had dealt with one in Iowa, a man who'd wanted to buy their homestead for less than it was worth, and who had found ways to create pressure when Thomas refused. She didn't say this to Wade. It wasn't her place. And besides, he knew Victor Hale far better than she did. But she began to pay attention to the riders she saw at the boundary line, whether it was the same gray horse or different ones, To the way ranch hands sometimes reported small things gone wrong, a gate left open that everyone swore they'd latched, a section of fence that had come down in a spot with no particularly good wind explanation. To the occasional stranger who appeared in Harrow Creek asking questions about the Blackstone situation, which reached them through Rosa's network of information, which was apparently extensive. It was Christmas Eve when Victor Hale first appeared in person. Evelyn had been in the kitchen since before dawn, and the ginger cake was cooling on the rack, and there was a beef roast in the oven, and she was pulling together the other parts of the meal when she heard horses in the yard and then voices, Wade's and another man's, lower, carrying without her being able to make out the words. She didn't go to the window immediately, but Lucy did, appearing from the hallway with her hair still in its night braid. "That's Mr. Hale," Lucy said, looking out. "He came last Christmas, too. Papa didn't let him in then either. He doesn't usually come to the house? He does whenever he thinks Papa might be feeling, I don't know, weak, maybe." Lucy said the word carefully, as if trying to be fair to a complicated thing. "Papa's never weak, but Mr. Hale seems to think Christmas makes people feel that way." Evelyn came to stand beside her, just enough to see the yard. Victor Hale was perhaps 45, with a face that had the smooth, well-fed quality of a man who has not missed many meals, and never the important ones. He was well dressed for a ranch call, heavy wool coat, good hat, gloves. He sat his horse with the ease of someone who'd been around horses all his life and knew the effect of the picture. He was speaking and smiling, and the smile did not go particularly far up his face. Wade was standing with his arms at his sides. He was not smiling. "He wants to buy us," Lucy said simply. "So I've heard. Papa will never sell." Lucy said this with absolute certainty. The certainty of a 9-year-old who has heard this stated often enough that it has become the structure of things. "This is Mama's ranch, too. He says that. It's always going to be ours." Evelyn watched Wade in the yard below. He had the contained, deliberate stillness she'd come to associate with him when he was angry, but was not going to show it. He said something to Victor Hale that was clearly a dismissal. Hale said something back, and this time the smile didn't come at all. And for just a moment that was over quickly, Evelyn saw what was underneath it. She thought, there is a man who is not accustomed to hearing no. Hale finally turned his horse and rode out through the main gate. Wade watched him go. He stood in the yard for a moment after the gate closed, and then he turned toward the house, and Evelyn stepped back from the window before he looked up. "Will he come back?" she asked Lucy. "He always comes back," Lucy said, without drama. As if this were simply a fact about the world, like winter coming, like the north pump freezing first. "But Papa always says no." She patted back toward the hall, apparently satisfied that the situation had resolved normally. Evelyn looked out the window at the empty gate, at the tracks in the snow where Victor Hale's horse had stood. She didn't know yet what he was capable of. She didn't know that he'd been watching her as carefully as he'd been watching the ranch itself, noting her arrival, noting her growing importance to the household, calculating what she meant for his plans. She didn't know that the visit today had not been a routine Christmas call. It had been assessment. He'd come to see what had changed. He'd seen enough. Wade came through the back door with cold air and mud on his boots and stopped when he smelled the ginger cake. Something in his face recalibrated, the tension from the yard releasing by a degree or two. "Cake's ready," Evelyn said. "I can smell that. The roast needs another hour." He hung up his coat and came to the kitchen table and sat down heavily, the way men sit when they've been holding themselves upright against something for too long. He rubbed the back of his neck. "Victor Hale came to make his seasonal offer," he said. "Lucy saw him from the window." "Of course she did." He was quiet for a moment. "He's made a new arrangement with the Dunmore Land Company out of Denver. They're backing him now, he mentioned it." A pause. "He wanted me to understand that he has more resources than the last time we spoke." "And you said?" Wade looked up at her. "I said what I always say, which is that I'd see him in hell before I'd sell him an inch of Eleanor's land." He said it flatly, without heat, which somehow made it more convincing. Evelyn nodded. "He noticed you," Wade said after a moment. She looked at him. "What do you mean?" "He mentioned, in passing, the way he mentions things he wants you to think are incidental. He mentioned that he'd heard I'd hired a new housekeeper, wanted to know where you'd come from." He paused. I told him it was none of his business. Evelyn was quiet. He'll ask around town, Wade said. He does that. Gathers information like some men gather land. He looked at her, and there was something in his face that was not warning exactly, more like transparency, like a man deciding to show his hand because he thought she deserved to see it. I want you to know that, so you're not surprised if you hear that questions have been asked. I appreciate you telling me. You haven't done anything you need to worry about. It was such a direct and unornamented statement of trust that Evelyn didn't know quite what to do with it for a moment. She looked at the cake cooling on the rack. The ginger is right, she said finally. I think Eleanor was correct about the recipe being timid. Wade looked at the cake for a long moment. Then he made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was close to one, low and tired and real. She always was, he said. About most things. From upstairs came the sound of Abigail calling Lucy for something, and Lucy calling back with her particular brand of authority, and the house settling around them all in the way that houses do when they are occupied and warm and imperfectly, stubbornly alive, which is the best any house can manage, and more than many do. Outside, the snow had started again. Victor Hale was already 7 miles south, riding back toward his own property, thinking. He had seen enough to know that the woman had changed things. The house had warmth that it hadn't had 6 months ago. The children were steady in a way that children are steady when they feel held, and Wade Blackstone, who had been showing the slow erosion of a man managing more grief than work, Wade Blackstone was, for the first time in 3 years, something that looked like himself again. Hale understood the mechanism clearly enough. He'd watched enough households in his life to know that the center of a family was rarely who you'd expect from the outside. The woman was the center now. She was the reason the fire was burning properly. So the fire needed to go out. He was patient. He had time, and he had money, and he had people in Harrow Creek who told him things. He would find what he needed. There was always something. A woman who drifted in from nowhere, alone without family or reference. There was always something. He rode south into the snow and began to think about how to use it. The snow held through January and into February, which was normal for this part of Colorado, and life at Blackstone Ranch settled into the particular rhythm of a hard winter, compressed, interior, defined by the management of cold and the conservation of everything that would be needed when it broke. Evelyn had been at the ranch for 10 weeks. Her trial period, by the terms Wade had laid out at the gate, had ended 3 weeks ago. Neither of them had mentioned it. Wade had increased her wages without discussion. She'd found the difference in the envelope Rosa handed her on the 1st of January and said nothing, and Wade said nothing, and that was the end of that negotiation. She had become part of the furniture of the place, which was both a humble and an accurate way to describe it. Not in the sense of being invisible, she was not invisible to these people anymore, but in the sense of being integrated into the structure. The house ran differently with her in it. She knew this without taking credit for it, the way you know a wheel is turning because the machinery is doing what it's supposed to do. Lucy had learned long division. This had taken 2 weeks of patient daily work and 1 afternoon of Lucy putting her head down on the table and saying into the crook of her elbow with absolute conviction that she would never understand it and furthermore did not see why she should. Evelyn had let her sit like that for a few minutes and then said, from across the table where she was mending a work shirt, "Your father says you can ride better than most of his hands." Lucy lifted her head slightly. He said that? Last Thursday. He was talking to one of the men in the yard. Lucy sat up fully, which was the goal. I've been riding since I was 4. So you learned something complicated when you were 4 because you wanted to. Lucy looked at her with the expression of someone who has recognized a trap but cannot see exactly where it's placed. That's different. Is it? I wanted to ride. Did you want to fall off? No? Did you fall off? A pause. Twice. And then? Lucy looked at the long division problem in front of her. She picked up the pencil. That's still different, she said, but she began working the problem. She had it by the end of the week. Abigail, for her part, had begun talking to Evelyn the way she talked to people she'd decided to trust. Not warmly, not with the impulsive affection Lucy threw around, but with honesty, which was worth more and cost her more. She'd started coming to the kitchen on Saturday mornings to help with the baking, not because she was asked, but because she'd decided she wanted to learn, and she learned the way she did everything. Methodically, taking notes in a small book she kept in her coat pocket, asking questions that were more sophisticated than they needed to be for the task at hand. One Saturday in late January, while they were making bread, Abigail said without preamble, "Do you think Papa is lonely?" Evelyn kept her hands moving in the dough. "What makes you ask?" "He seems, I don't know, less lonely than he did." A pause. "Since you came." Evelyn said nothing for a moment. "I'm not saying—" Abigail started and then seemed to lose the thread of what she wasn't saying, which was unusual for her. "He has a lot on his mind," Evelyn said carefully. "Running this place alone is a weight. He doesn't talk to us the way he used to. Before Mama died. He talks to us now, but before he used to tell us stories at dinner about his day, about what went wrong and what went right, funny things that happened." Abigail's hands were still in the dough. "He stopped for a while. He's starting again." She looked at Evelyn sideways. "Since you came, people move at their own pace through hard things," Evelyn said. "It's not always someone else's doing when they come out the other side." "I know that." Abigail turned back to her bread. "I'm just saying I've noticed." Evelyn nodded and let the conversation close, because some things needed to be said and then left alone rather than examined from every angle until they meant less than they had. But she thought about it afterward, in the quiet moments. She thought about the evenings when Wade appeared in the kitchen doorway on his way somewhere else and ended up staying 20 minutes talking about something that had happened with the cattle, or asking her opinion on whether they needed to order more lamp oil before the passes opened, or telling her something Lucy had said that had made him laugh in the private way he kept most of his laughter. She thought about the particular quality of his attention when she spoke, the way he listened to her, the way you listen to someone whose mind you've decided you respect. She did not let herself make too much of it. She had been down roads that seemed to lead somewhere warm and found them ending in fields, and she was not 20 anymore, and this was not her house and not her family. And her position here was still, at its core, that of an employee who had gotten lucky at a gate on a cold November afternoon. But she was aware of it, the way you're aware of a thing without naming it. The first sign that something had changed came in the second week of February, and she almost missed it. She'd been into Harrow Creek with Rosa for the monthly supply run, Wade's buckboard, and 2 of the horses. The road passable now after a few warmer days had compacted the snow. Rosa handled most of the business with the merchants, the accounts that ran in Wade's name, the orders that needed to be placed for spring. Evelyn came primarily to select provisions herself and to stretch her legs after weeks of the house. She noticed it first in the dry goods store. She'd been standing at the counter waiting for the shopkeeper to wrap the sugar she'd purchased, and she became aware that the 2 women on the other side of the store had stopped talking in the natural way that people stop talking in public when they're going to start talking about something they don't want overheard. She didn't look at them directly. She paid for her sugar and thanked the shopkeeper and went out to the buckboard. Rosa came out 10 minutes later with a different expression than she'd gone in with. "Something's in the air," Rosa said, climbing up to the bench. "I noticed. There were questions this morning before we arrived." Rosa unwrapped the reins. "About you." Evelyn looked at her. "What kind of questions?" "The kind men like Victor Hale pay people to ask." Rosa kept her eyes on the horses. "About where you came from, whether anyone had checked your story, whether a woman alone with no family and no references might have a reason for being alone." A pause. "The kind of questions designed so that the answer doesn't matter, because the question itself is the damage." Evelyn sat very still on the buckboard bench. "What did they say?" she asked. Practically, because she needed to know what shape the thing had. "Nothing specific yet. That's how it starts. Not with accusations, with suggestions, with a particular kind of interest." Rosa clicked the horses forward. "He's building something." Evelyn looked at the road ahead. The mountains to the west were white and enormous in the February light, indifferent the way large things are. "I'll tell Wade," she said. "I think that's right." She told him that evening after the girls had gone up. She went to the door of his study and knocked, and when he called for her to come in, she stood in the doorway. She usually didn't come into the study. It was his space, and she had respected that, and told him what Rosa had observed, plainly, without decoration. He listened with his hands flat on the desk, and his face doing what his face did when he was angry and was not going to let it become the primary information. What he's looking for, Wade said when she'd finished, is something he can use. Something about your past that he can shape into a reason for people to doubt you, and therefore doubt the household. Yes, he looked at her. Is there anything he might find? It was a direct question and deserved a direct answer. She didn't flinch from it. I came from Iowa, she said. My husband Thomas died in the spring of '83. I lost our farm to debt after that. I've been working since, boarding houses, domestic work, whatever I could find. There's nothing criminal, nothing. There's nothing he can find that's real. Real doesn't always matter to men like Hale, Wade said. They build with what they have, and they're not particular about materials. I know. He was quiet for a moment. I'll speak to Sheriff Aldine in town. He's honest. He won't move on rumors, but he'll know to watch for what Hale's doing. He paused. I want you to stay close to the ranch for the time being. Not because you've done anything wrong, because I don't want you dealing with whatever he stirs up in town without someone at your back. It was not a comfortable thing, being managed for her own protection. She felt it in the way you feel any restriction, even a sensible one. But she nodded. There's something else, she said. He waited. When he was here on Christmas Eve, you said he noticed me. She paused. I think I understand now what that meant. I think he sees me as a variable that shouldn't exist, something that changed the calculation. Wade looked at her for a long, steady moment. You have changed the calculation, he said, plainly. As a fact, not a compliment. For the better. That's exactly why he's doing this. Evelyn nodded and went back to the kitchen and stood by the stove for a while doing nothing, which was something she rarely permitted herself. She got sick on a Tuesday in early March. It came on slowly at first, a heaviness in the head that she attributed to a poor night's sleep, a nausea that came and went through the morning while she was working. By afternoon, she was shaking. By evening, she was in bed with a fever that Rosa measured at 103 and a pain in her abdomen that was not like anything she'd had before. Not the cramping of an ordinary illness, but something deeper and more deliberate feeling, though she knew that was not a rational way to describe a fever. Wade sent for the doctor from Harrow Creek the following morning, a man named Howell, who arrived in the late afternoon with the particular air of a man who had been doing this work long enough to be neither reassured nor alarmed by the appearance of a sick person before he'd examined them. He came out of her room after 20 minutes looking at his hands. It's not influenza, he said, to Wade in the hall. Fever, abdominal distress, the presentation of the symptoms. I've seen this before. He said the next thing carefully, in the way that men of his profession learn to say things that might be contested. I'd want to be certain, but I think she's been poisoned. The hallway went very quiet. Poisoned, Wade repeated. Something introduced to the food or drink. Likely not in large quantity. If it were a large dose, she'd be worse than she is. But the symptom pattern is... He paused. I've seen it twice. Both times it was something put in food. From further down the hall, behind her bedroom door, they could hear the sound of Evelyn's breathing, which was labored and wrong. Will she... Wade started. If the dose was small and we keep the fever down, she should recover. Howell was already opening his bag. I'll leave medication and instructions. She needs to stay in bed, take nothing by mouth except boiled water and clear broth until I say otherwise, and someone should watch her through the night. He was gone by dark. Rosa took the first watch through the night, sitting in the chair beside Evelyn's bed with a cloth for the fever and the quiet competence of a woman who had watched people be sick before and knew that most of what you could do was be present while the body worked it out. Abigail appeared in the doorway at midnight, in her coat over her nightgown, her hair loose and her face stripped of everything except fear. Rosa, she said. Is she? She's fighting, Rosa said. Go back to bed. I want to help. You can help in the morning. Sleep now. Rosa looked at her steadily. She's going to be all right, Abigail. Your being awake won't make her better faster. Abigail stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she said quietly, She was making beef broth for supper. I had some. Should I be... You're feeling well? Yes. Then it wasn't the broth. Rosa had already thought about this. Something she consumed that the rest of you didn't. Abigail disappeared and Rosa turned back to Evelyn, who was in that place between sleep and not sleep that high fever creates, present enough to respond to her name if you said it, not present enough to be anywhere that made sense. Rosa sat through the night and changed the cloth and spoke to Evelyn in Spanish when the fever climbed, which she'd found helped, though she couldn't have said why. She'd worked in other households where other bad things had happened, and she'd learned that the main thing was to stay, which was harder than it sounded and mattered more than almost anything else you could do. Wade came at 3 in the morning and sat in the chair Rosa vacated for him and stayed until the sky began to lighten. Evelyn's fever broke sometime around dawn. Not all the way down, but enough. Her breathing changed into something more normal, and the color of her face shifted from the dull red of high fever to something less alarming. She opened her eyes briefly and looked at the ceiling and then at Wade, who was sitting beside her. "You look terrible," she said, which was the first intelligible thing she'd said in 12 hours. "That's fair," he said. His voice was rough in the way voices get when they haven't been used for a while. "You don't look much better. How long have I—" "Since yesterday morning. It's early Thursday." She processed this. "The girls are fine. Abigail made breakfast this morning." A pause, and something crossed his face that was not amusement exactly, but was not nothing. "She burned the first batch of biscuits." "Did she make another batch?" "She did." "Good." Evelyn closed her eyes again. "That's the right thing to do." He told her what Howell had said. He watched her face as he said it, not for a reaction of guilt, because that was not a thing he was looking for, but because he wanted to see how she took it. She took it the way she took most things that came at her hard. She went still, she thought about it, and then she came back to what was in front of her. "Something I ate that the others didn't," she said. "That's what Rosa worked out." "The tea." She said it slowly, working backward through the day. "I had a cup of tea in the late morning. I made it myself from the tin in the pantry. I don't know if anyone else used that tin." Wade was already standing. He went to the kitchen and came back 10 minutes later with a look on his face that she read accurately before he said anything. "The tin was moved," he said. "Rosa keeps things in a specific order. That tin was not where it belongs. Someone was in the pantry. We have 11 ranch hands. The house is not always locked during the day." He sat down again. "Someone was paid to get into that pantry." Evelyn looked at the ceiling. She thought about Victor Hale on his gray horse, patient and calculating at the boundary line. She thought about what Rosa had said. The kind of questions designed so the answer doesn't matter, because the question itself is the damage. This was not the question. This was something that came after the question hadn't been enough. "He escalated," she said. "Yes." "Because I'm still here." Wade looked at her steadily. "Because you're still here," he confirmed. She held that thought for a moment. It was a strange and deeply uncomfortable thing to know that your continued existence in a place had provoked someone into trying to end it. She was used to being invisible. She'd been invisible to most of the world for the past 2 years, drifting through towns where nobody knew her name. She was not accustomed to mattering enough to be a target. "I'm going to Sheriff Aldine today," Wade said. "This isn't rumor spreading anymore." "Be careful what you can prove," she said. "Without proof—" "I know." His jaw was tight. "I know." She recovered over the following week, slowly and with bad grace, which was not her usual way of doing things. She was not a good patient. She found the enforced stillness intolerable after the second day, and argued with Rosa about when she could be up, and Rosa won the argument with the particular authority of someone who has information you don't, which was that Evelyn standing up on the third day had made her dizzy enough to have to sit immediately back down. She stayed in bed. She hated it. Lucy came and sat with her every afternoon, which was the most openly tender thing the girl had done, and which Evelyn recognized as costing her something. Lucy brought the natural history book with the illustrations and read aloud from it, badly, in the monotone of someone who could read well but found reading aloud awkward, stopping to show her the pictures with an earnestness that Evelyn found almost unbearable in the best way. On the 5th day, Lucy came in and sat down in the chair beside the bed and did not open the book. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Evelyn looked at her. "Of what?" "Of the person who put something in your tea." Evelyn thought about whether to be honest and decided that she always had to be honest with Lucy, because Lucy could read a lie in her face the same way she could read it in anyone else's. "A little," she said. "Yes." Lucy nodded very seriously. "I'm afraid too," she said. "But I'm also angry." Angry is good. Angry means you've decided it's wrong and you're going to say so. I've decided it's wrong. Lucy's hands were folded in her lap and her chin was level. For a moment, she looked startlingly like her father. And when I find out who it is, I'm going to say so to their face. Let's let your father and Sheriff Aldine do the finding first. That doesn't mean I won't also say so. Evelyn looked at the 9-year-old sitting across from her with complete moral clarity and felt something press behind her sternum that she didn't let become anything visible. No, she said. That's fair. She was back on her feet by the second week of March, still not entirely herself. The poison, whatever it had been, had left a tiredness in her that lasted longer than the fever itself, but functional and unwilling to be otherwise. She came back to the kitchen and the lessons and the management of the house, and she noted, without making much of it, that Abigail had kept things running with a competence that was both impressive and slightly humbling, and that Lucy had set the table every night without being asked, and that Wade had eaten most of his meals in the kitchen with the girls rather than at his desk, which was a choice she suspected had more to do with not wanting to be alone than with anything else. She said none of this. She came back and resumed, and the household absorbed her return the way a body absorbs warmth after cold, gradually and then all at once. But the town of Harrow Creek had been busy while she was sick. Victor Hale had not waited. He had used the 2 weeks of her illness, the doctor's call, the shutdown of the house, the visible vulnerability of Blackstone Ranch, to do the thing Rosa had predicted from the beginning. He'd moved from suggestions to statements, from questions to accusations, carefully worded enough to stay out of legal trouble, but pointed enough to land. The story that circulated through Harrow Creek had a particular shape. A woman had appeared from nowhere with no verifiable background, had insinuated herself into a grieving widower's household, and had already extracted a wage increase in less than 3 months. There were mentions, always from unnamed parties, always secondhand, of other households she'd allegedly worked in, other wealthy widowers, other convenient circumstances. Nothing specific, nothing that could be traced, just the general outline of a narrative about a certain type of woman, the type men in frontier towns knew what to make of. The first sign that it had worked came when one of the ranch hands quit without explanation, a man named Hargrove who'd been at Blackstone for 2 years and had never given any trouble. He left on a Wednesday and didn't come back. The second sign came when the shopkeeper in Harrow Creek, not the man at the dry goods store, but the woman at the millinery who had always been pleasant to Rosa, told Rosa, with visible discomfort, that she wouldn't be extending account credit to Blackstone Ranch until the current situation was resolved. What situation? Rosa had asked. The woman had not been specific. She'd been apologetic and not specific, which was its own answer. The third sign came in the form of a letter delivered to Wade Blackstone from the county commissioner's office in Hayden, requesting that he attend a public hearing to address concerns raised by members of the Harrow Creek community regarding the management of the Blackstone property and the welfare of the minor children in his household. It was the most genteel way Evelyn had ever seen a person accused of something. Wade set the letter on the kitchen table when Evelyn and Rosa were both present and let them read it. Then he said, with the controlled evenness of a man who had decided the measure of himself was not going to be set by Victor Hale, "This is what he's been building toward." "He's not named in the letter," Rosa observed. "He doesn't have to be." Wade sat down. "He's the one who filed the concerns. He has enough people in his pocket that they'll show up to the hearing to testify. And the commissioner's office will feel obligated to take it seriously because of his relationship with the Dunmore Land Company." He paused. "It's about the children. If he can make the county believe the girls are in an unsuitable situation, he can petition for oversight of the ranch and find some legal pressure point to apply." "And if the pressure point doesn't hold?" Evelyn asked. "Then he loses, and he knows it." Wade looked at her. "Which is why the attack is on you and not on me." Evelyn absorbed this. The letter said concerns. The concerns, she understood, were about her background, her character, her suitability. They were not directly stated. They didn't need to be. The shape of a thing is sometimes enough to do the work, even without the substance. "When is the hearing?" she asked. 3 weeks. Second week of April. She thought about this. She thought about Harrow Creek and the women who had stopped talking when she came into the store, and the credit that had been revoked, and the ranch hand who had left without explaining himself. She thought about what it meant to have your name turned into a question someone was asking about you in rooms you weren't in. She had been here before. Not in the same form, but in the same substance. She knew what it was to have your integrity treated as a matter of public debate by people who had decided the conclusion before examining the evidence. "I want to be at the hearing," she said. Wade looked at her carefully. "That might not be—" "I want to be there," she said again. "Whatever he says about me, I want to be in the room when he says it. They'll be hard on you. They've already decided something." "I know." She looked back at him steadily. "I've been decided about before. I'd rather be in the room." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he nodded. The 3 weeks before the hearing were the strangest Evelyn had spent at Blackstone Ranch, because everything was the same and nothing was. She cooked and cleaned and taught lessons and managed the household and went about the daily work that she had come to know as well as she had ever known any work. But underneath all of it, like a sound too low to locate, was the knowledge of what was coming and what was at stake, and she carried it with her through every room of the house and could not quite put it down. The girls knew, which she supposed was inevitable. Wade had told them something. Not everything, but the shape of it. Abigail had come to her with a directness that was by now familiar and said, "Someone is saying things about you, bad things, because of Mr. Hale." "Yes," Evelyn said. "Are they true?" "No." Abigail looked at her. "I didn't think so," she said, and went back to what she'd been doing with a finality that suggested the matter was settled, at least for her. Lucy did not take the settled approach. Lucy was angry in the sustained and burning way of someone who hasn't yet learned that anger needs to be managed as well as felt, which meant she spent 3 days banging pots and doors and finally appeared at Evelyn's elbow one morning while Evelyn was making the breakfast biscuits and said fiercely, "What can I do?" Evelyn considered her. "Right now?" "About it. About the hearing. About Mr. Hale." "Right now," Evelyn said, "you can tell the truth to anyone who asks you a direct question. That's what you can do." "That's not enough. Sometimes it's the only thing there is." She handed Lucy a biscuit cutter. "Here. The dough's ready." Lucy took the cutter and pressed it into the dough with more force than was strictly necessary. "I hate this," she said. "I know. It's not fair." "No. Then why aren't you angry?" Evelyn looked at the biscuits taking shape on the pan. She thought about Iowa, about the debt collector who'd come to the door 2 weeks after Thomas died and had spoken to her in a particular way. Not cruel, not even unkind, just certain of her diminishment, certain she had no recourse, certain she would accept what was being done because what else could she do? She thought about the way she'd felt then, which was not nothing. It was not nothing. "I am angry," she said. "I'm just not going to let the anger run in front of me like I can't control it." She looked at Lucy. "When you go into a room where people have decided something about you, you need to be the most composed person there, because the moment you're not, they'll use it to say you're exactly what they decided." Lucy pressed the cutter into the dough again, more carefully this time. "What if they don't change their minds?" she asked. "Then they don't. But I'll know I told the truth, and your father will know I told the truth, and you and Abigail will know." She paused. "That's not nothing. It should be more than that." "It should be," Evelyn agreed. "But you work with what is, not what should be." The morning of the hearing came gray and cold, with the last gasp of the Colorado winter refusing to let go entirely. The hearing was held in the community hall in Harrow Creek, a large room that was used for town meetings and social events, and apparently occasions like this one, which were neither. Wade came with Evelyn and Rosa. He had asked Sheriff Aldine to come as well, and Aldine had come, which told you something about what he thought of the complaint. The room was fuller than Evelyn had expected. She recognized some faces from her trips to town with Rosa. There were others she didn't know, and among the people she didn't know were a number of men in good coats who did not have the look of Harrow Creek ranchers and farmers, who had, in fact, the particular look of people who had come from somewhere else at someone else's expense. Victor Hale was there, to the side, with the composed expression of a man observing something he had arranged. He saw her come in and his expression did not change. That was how she knew he was confident. The commissioner, a man named Aldridge, who had the uncertain manner of someone caught between competing obligations, called the hearing to order and read the formal concerns from the petition, which were that a woman of unknown background and unverified character had been engaged in an intimate relationship with the widowed owner of Blackstone Ranch while having access to and influence over his minor children, and that multiple members of the community had witnessed behavior and circumstances suggesting that the situation endangered the welfare of said children. She sat and listened to this and kept her face still. The first witness, one of Hale's men in a good coat, spoke about a woman matching Evelyn's description who had worked a ranch in Wyoming, claimed to be a widow, and had left under circumstances that were, he said carefully, irregular. He was not specific about the circumstances. He did not need to be. The second witness, a woman from Harrow Creek, who ran a boarding house, said that she'd heard from a reliable source that Evelyn Hartwell had been known in Pueblo under a different name. She could not produce this reliable source. Commissioner Aldridge noted this with visible discomfort, but did not dismiss the testimony. There were two more witnesses of similar quality. The information vague, the suggestion pointed, the sourcing invisible. Then Commissioner Aldridge looked at the room and asked if anyone had anything further to add. Evelyn stood up. She had not planned exactly what she was going to say. She'd thought about it for 3 weeks and had tried to plan it and had finally concluded, somewhere around 2 a.m. of the fourth day before the hearing, that the only thing that was going to help her was the truth stated plainly, not performed, not managed, not calibrated for effect, just true. The room got quiet. "My name is Evelyn Hartwell," she said. "I was born Evelyn Marsh in Columbus, Ohio, in 1854. I can tell you the names of the people I grew up with and where they are now, if anyone cares to verify. I married Thomas Hartwell in 1877. We moved to Iowa in 1879 and built a homestead outside a town called Carmichael." She paused. "In July of 1883, our house caught fire. Thomas pulled our daughter out of her room. Clara was 4 years old." She stopped again. The room was very still. "He got her out, but the smoke had already—" She stopped a third time. "We lost Clara 6 days after the fire. Thomas got sick that winter and died in April of 1884. The farm went to debt. I left Iowa in the fall of 1884, and I have been working ever since." The silence in the room had a different quality than it had before she'd stood up. "I have not worked under a different name," she said. "I have not preyed on anyone. I worked a boarding house in Lincoln, Nebraska for 4 months. I worked private domestic positions in 2 houses in Pueblo before those families relocated. I can give you those names too." She looked at Commissioner Aldridge and then, briefly and directly, at Victor Hale. "I came to Blackstone Ranch in November with nothing except 2 dresses and the ability to cook and manage a house. Mr. Blackstone offered me a position, and I have done that work to the best of my ability every day since." She sat down. The room erupted. Not violently, not with shouting, though there was some of that, but with the particular noise of a large group of people discovering that they had been arranged into a position they weren't entirely comfortable with. Commissioner Aldridge called for order. One of Hale's men in the good coats said something that was lost in the noise. A woman near the back of the room, whom Evelyn did not know, said, clearly and over the general sound, "Let her finish." And then from the left side of the room, a man Evelyn had never met before stood up and said that he was a rancher named Cotter from the valley south of Harrow Creek, and that he had employed a man named Silas Marsh 2 years ago who had left his service to go work for Victor Hale, and that Silas Marsh had told him, before leaving, that Hale was looking for someone who could get access to Blackstone property and had offered good money for it. The room got loud again. Victor Hale stood up and said that this was preposterous and that he would not sit here and be accused by... And then Sheriff Aldine stood up. Aldine was a tall man with a quiet voice and the manner of someone who had been listening carefully for a long time and had now heard enough. "I have here," he said, holding up a paper, "a bill of sale for a quantity of antimony compounds purchased from a druggist in Hayden in January of this year. The name on the bill is Silas Marsh." He paused. "Antimony sulfide, in the doses described by Dr. Howell's report on Miss Hartwell's illness, produces symptoms consistent with what Dr. Howell observed. I have also spoken this morning with the druggist in question, and his description of the man who made the purchase matches Silas Marsh in height, build, and other particulars." The noise in the community hall rose to something that was not quite chaos and was not quite order, that lived in the space between them the way most real things do. Victor Hale's face, across the room, had finally shown her something. He was looking at her, and for the first time in all of this, he did not look composed. He looked like a man who has watched his plan arrive at the wrong destination. Commissioner Aldridge was banging his gavel. The women near the back of the room were talking to each other in rapid undertones. Wade Blackstone, beside Evelyn, had not moved, but she could feel the quality of his stillness had shifted into something that was not restraint anymore. It was something harder than that, something that had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Evelyn sat with her hands in her lap and looked at the front of the room and breathed steadily, the way you breathe when the worst thing has come and has shown you, as it passed, that you are still standing. She was still standing. That was not a small thing. She knew that. She had always known that it was the main thing, the thing you came back to when everything else was loud and uncertain and unresolved. But the resolution was not here yet. The room was still full of noise. Victor Hale was already speaking to the man beside him in a quick, low voice. Commissioner Aldridge had not made any official determination. The bill of sale was evidence, but evidence needed to be followed, traced, confirmed. And that was not the work of this morning. This morning had only done one thing. It had made the truth available. Whether the truth was enough was a different question, and it would have to wait for a different day. The community hall did not empty quickly. That was the thing about a room full of people who had come expecting one outcome and received something considerably more complicated. They didn't simply file out and go home and resume their lives. They stood in clusters and talked, and the talking had a different quality than the talking before the hearing, less certain and more ragged at the edges, the way conversation sounds when people are quietly revising something they thought they knew. Evelyn stayed in her seat while Wade spoke with Sheriff Aldine near the front of the room. She was aware of being looked at, had been aware of it since she'd stood up and said Clara's name in this room full of strangers. But the quality of the looks had changed. Some were still suspicious, some were unreadable, but some had shifted into something she recognized because she'd seen it in people's faces before when a thing they'd been told turned out to be different than they'd been told. A particular kind of uncomfortable reassessment, the expression of someone who doesn't yet know what to do with having been wrong. Rosa sat beside her without speaking. That was the right thing, and Rosa always seemed to know what the right thing was. Commissioner Aldridge came over after about 10 minutes, holding his papers with both hands in the way of a man who would prefer something to do with them. He was not a bad man, Evelyn had decided by this point. He was a cautious man who had been presented with a complaint from a powerful quarter and had been trying to handle it by procedure, which was the approach of someone who trusted process over judgment and had made himself useful to both sides of this by being committed to neither. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I want to—" He paused, tried again. "The petition will not proceed. I want you to know that. Given the information presented by Sheriff Aldine, and given the testimony offered from the floor this morning, the original complaints they're not sustainable." He was looking at his papers rather than at her. "I regret that you were placed in this position." "Do you?" Evelyn asked. He looked up at her. The question was not combative. It was genuine, and he seemed to hear that. "Yes," he said after a moment. "I do. This office should have— the standard of evidence required before calling a public hearing of this nature should have been higher." He paused. "That's a deficiency I intend to address." Evelyn nodded. She didn't tell him that the regret, however genuine, did not undo the weeks of rumor in the town, or the credit that had been revoked, or the ranch hand who had left, or the fact that she had stood up in this room and said her daughter's name to prove she was a real person. The regret didn't undo any of that. But it was real, and she could see it was real, and she had learned not to refuse the real things because they weren't enough. "Thank you," she said. He nodded and moved away, and Rosa, beside her, exhaled slowly in a way that was her version of a significant statement. Across the room, Victor Hale was still there. He had not left, which she'd half expected him to do. He was talking to the two men in good coats, and his back was to the room, and there was a set to his shoulders that was not quite defeat. Men like Hale didn't get to defeat easily. They had too much practice at finding the next angle. But it was something removed from his usual composure, something that recognized the ground had shifted under him in a way he hadn't planned for. He turned eventually and found her looking at him across the hall. He held her gaze for a moment, 3 seconds, 4, and then he looked away first, which was not nothing. Sheriff Aldine rode out to Hale's property the following Monday with 2 deputies, which was the part of this that moved on its own schedule, the schedule of law and procedure, and the careful assembly of the kind of evidence that holds in a formal proceeding rather than a community hall. Evelyn was not part of that process and did not try to be. She heard about it through Wade, who heard about it through Aldine, who was the kind of sheriff that reported to the people most directly affected without embellishment or drama. Silas Marsh had been located in Hayden, which was where he'd gone after leaving the Blackstone property following the poisoning. He had not gone far, which suggested either poor planning or confidence that the thing would land the way Hale had expected it to, and there would be nothing to run from. When Aldine found him, he was in a boarding house, and his first response to the sheriff's appearance was to look at him for a long moment and then say, with the particular flatness of a man who has been calculating the arithmetic of loyalty against consequences and has reached a conclusion, "I want to talk." This was, Wade told her, the moment the structure of Hale's scheme collapsed in the way that structures collapse, when the material they're built from decides it would rather be somewhere else. Marsh talked. He talked about the arrangement Hale had made with him, the access he'd been paid to provide, the compound he'd been given and told to introduce into the household's food supply, the specific instructions about how much and when and what to tell people if questions came up. He talked about the other arrangements Hale had made in Harrow Creek, the people he'd paid to spread the story about Evelyn, the man at the commissioner's office he'd cultivated over 2 years for exactly this kind of moment. He talked, and Aldine wrote it down. And the Dunmore Land Company's attorneys in Denver, when they were notified, immediately issued a statement clarifying that their arrangement with Victor Hale pertained only to legitimate land acquisition, and that they had no knowledge of or involvement in any activities of the nature described, which was the corporate version of a man stepping sideways out of a photograph before it's taken. Hale was arrested on a Thursday, 11 days after the hearing. Wade came home from town that evening and told Evelyn and Rosa at the kitchen table, and his voice was even and his face was composed, but she could see in the particular stillness of his hands on the table that it had cost him something to hold himself together through the day. "He'll get lawyers from Denver," Wade said. "Good ones. This won't be quick." "Will it hold?" Evelyn asked. "Aldine thinks so. Marsh's testimony, the bill of sale, the druggist's identification, it's not nothing." He paused. "It's enough to make the cost of continuing very high for Hale. Whether he fights it in court or not, his position here is—" He stopped, searched for the right word. "Untenable," he said. "Even if his lawyers find something to work with, the county knows what he tried to do. That doesn't go away." Rosa said nothing. She picked up her coffee and drank it and set it down. From upstairs came the sound of Abigail's footsteps crossing her room, a sound Evelyn had learned to distinguish from Lucy's by now, the different weight and rhythm of 2 girls who move through the world differently. And then a pause, and then both sets of footsteps on the stairs. They came into the kitchen together. Abigail stood at the edge of the room with her arms folded in the way that meant she'd been thinking about something for a while and had organized her thoughts and was ready to deliver them. Lucy stood beside her with her hands in the pockets of her pinafore and her chin up. "Well?" Abigail said. "He's been arrested," Wade told them. Abigail unfolded her arms. Something released in her face. "Good," she said, simply and completely, and that was all she said about it. Lucy looked at Evelyn. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I am," Evelyn said. "You look tired." "It's been a long couple of weeks." Lucy came to the table and sat down across from her, which she did the way she did most things, with direct and slightly unsettling purpose. "We're not going to let anyone do that again," she said. "Lucy," Wade started. "I'm not saying I'll do something about it," Lucy said, with the precision of someone who has anticipated this objection. "I'm saying we won't let it happen. That's different. It means paying attention." Evelyn looked at the 9-year-old across the table. "When did you get so sensible?" she asked. Lucy considered this. "I've always been sensible," she said. "I just don't always feel like showing it." Abigail made a sound that was most of a laugh. It was the most relaxed sound Evelyn had heard from her in weeks, and it changed the quality of the room the way a window opening changes a room, letting something out and something in at the same time. The apologies came in the way apologies usually come, which is to say, imperfectly and at varying speeds and with varying degrees of sincerity, and Evelyn received them all with the same response, which was a nod and a thank you and no elaboration, because she had decided that elaborating on someone else's apology was a way of making it about yourself rather than about the thing being repaired. The shopkeeper at the millinery came first. She appeared at the gate of Blackstone Ranch on a Saturday, which took some nerve, and Rosa brought her to the kitchen where Evelyn was working, and the woman, her name was Mrs. Garfield, which Evelyn had not known before, stood in the middle of the kitchen holding a covered basket and looking at the floor. "I withdrew the account credit," she said, "without speaking to you directly, without—" She paused. "I should have spoken to you directly. I listened to what I was told, and I didn't ask the right questions, and I'm sorry." Evelyn looked at her. She was a woman of about 60, with the weathered, capable look of someone who had run a business alone in a frontier town for a long time, and she was visibly uncomfortable in a way that was not performed. The discomfort of someone who knows the difference between what they should have done and what they did. "I appreciate you coming," Evelyn said. "Sit down, if you'd like. I just made coffee." Mrs. Garfield sat down. She put the basket on the table. It had bread in it, fresh, which had clearly been baked that morning. She didn't mention the bread. Evelyn didn't mention it either. They drank their coffee and talked about other things, about the coming spring and the state of the roads and a delivery Mrs. Garfield was expecting from the east. And somewhere in the middle of the ordinary conversation, the apology became a thing that had been handled and could be left alone. The ranch hand who'd quit, Hargrove, came back the following week with his hat in his hands and asked to speak with Wade. Wade hired him back, though with a period of probation that Evelyn thought was appropriate and that Hargrove accepted without argument, which told you something about the quality of the man under the bad decision. Others came more slowly. A few never came at all. Evelyn noted this without particular bitterness because she understood that some people are invested in their opinions the way they're invested in property. Giving it up felt like a loss, even if what they were giving up was wrong. There were 2 women in Harrow Creek who had spoken against her at the hearing who she saw again in town over the following weeks, and both of them managed to look directly past her in the particular way of people who have decided the most efficient path forward is to behave as though an event did not occur. She was all right with this. It was honest, in its way, easier to deal with than the people who apologized without meaning it. What surprised her was the rancher Cotter, who had stood up in the community hall and said what he knew about Silas Marsh and Hale. She'd asked Wade about him afterward, and Wade had said Cotter was a straightforward man, not someone who played angles, and that she should probably thank him if the opportunity arose. The opportunity arose at the general store in Harrow Creek 3 weeks after the hearing. Evelyn saw him across the floor, a man of about 50, spare and sun-darkened, loading provisions onto a cart with the efficiency of someone who has been doing this particular task for decades. She went to him and said, "Mr. Cotter." He turned. He had the kind of face that didn't perform surprise particularly well and didn't try to. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "I wanted to thank you for what you said at the hearing." He looked at her steadily. "I said what I knew," he said. "That's what a person's supposed to do." "It took something to stand up in that room." "Not as much as it took you," he said, without sentiment, just as a fact. "I had nothing to lose in that room. You had everything." Evelyn held his gaze. "I appreciate it, regardless." He nodded. He picked up the next sack for his cart. "Hale's had this county in a grip for a while," he said, not quite looking at her, speaking toward the task in front of him. "Some of us have been watching him work for years and not been in a position to say much about it. What happened in that hall? It opened something up." He paused. "You're doing as much as anyone's." She left the store with the image of him returning to his provisions, an ordinary man going about ordinary work, having said a thing that needed saying and then going back to the day. That, she thought, was what integrity looked like most of the time. Not grand or showy, just a person saying the true thing when it was inconvenient and then getting on with it. The week after the hearing and the arrest, the thing that had been growing slowly between her and Wade Blackstone began to change in a way that neither of them acknowledged directly, and both of them were aware of. It was not dramatic. The frontier did not produce the conditions for drama of the tender kind. There was too much work, too little privacy, too constant a set of practical demands from the land and the cattle and the house and the children. What it produced instead was accumulation, small moments that stacked up without announcement. He found her on the back porch one evening, which was not usual. She rarely used the back porch in the evenings, but she'd gone out because the kitchen had felt suddenly very small and she'd needed a moment of cold air. She was standing with her hands on the porch rail, looking at the pasture in the early dark when she heard the door behind her. He came to stand beside her, not close, at the other end of the rail. He didn't say anything for a while. Neither did she. "I've been thinking," he said finally. "About what?" "About the hearing. About what you said." He was quiet for a moment. "About your daughter." Evelyn kept her eyes on the pasture. The cattle were dark shapes against the darkening field. "Clara," she said, "you've never talked about her." "No. I'm not asking you to." A pause. "I just wanted to say her name, if that's—" He stopped, tried again. "I wanted you to know I heard it." She didn't say anything for a moment. There was a particular kind of thing a person could do for you that was not comfort, and was not pity, and was not advice. That was simply the act of recognizing that a thing had happened and that the thing mattered. It was harder to do than most people thought. He had done it without making it about himself, or about his own loss, or about what it meant for anything between them. She was grateful for this in a way she didn't know how to put into words and didn't try to. "She would have been 7 in June," Evelyn said. It was the first time she'd said this to anyone in 2 years. She had Thomas's eyes. She stopped there because that was where the locked room was, and she was not going to open it on this porch tonight, but she'd said something true out loud and let him hear it, and that was enough for now. Wade nodded. He didn't say he was sorry, which most people did, because sorry was the word you used when you didn't know what else to say, and it never quite fit the shape of the thing it was applied to. He just nodded, and they stood on the porch in the cold air, and the dark came down over the mountains and the cattle moved slowly in the field. After a while he said, "This ranch has been very quiet for a long time." "It doesn't seem quiet to me," she said. 2 girls and 11 hands. I mean a different kind of quiet." He looked out at the pasture. "The kind that gets inside. After Eleanor—" He paused. "I kept the machinery running. The ranch kept going. But the inside of it was quiet in a way I couldn't fix and stopped trying to." Evelyn said nothing. "Since you've been here," he said, "it's been different. The girls are different. The house is—" He stopped again. He was not a man who had a ready vocabulary for interior things, and she understood that this was costing him something, the effort of naming it. "It's not quiet the same way anymore." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the pasture. "Wade," she said. It was the first time she'd used his given name without it being a practical necessity. He turned to look at her. His face in the near dark was the face she'd come to know over these months. Direct and not easy and honest. The face of a man who did not offer more than he meant. "I know what I want to say," he said. "I'm not going to say all of it tonight." "All right," she said. "But I want you to know—" He stopped. "I want you to know that what he put you through, what this town put you through, it shouldn't have happened, and that I—" He seemed to look for the right word for a long time. "I'm glad you're here," he said. "I'm glad you didn't move along when Tommy told you to." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "So am I." It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was just 2 people standing on a porch in the dark saying true things, which is its own kind of arrival. He went back inside a few minutes later. She stayed a little longer, watching the shapes of the cattle in the field, feeling the cold on her face, and she let herself think about the fact that she was here, not just physically here, but here in the way you are here when you have a place that holds you. She had not had that in a long time. The legal process around Victor Hale moved at the speed that legal processes moved, which was to say slowly, in ways that periodically produced news and then went quiet again for weeks. His attorneys from Denver did appear, as Wade had predicted, and they were good ones. And the early months of the proceedings were the careful back and forth of people trying to establish what could be proved and what it could be proved against whom. But Silas Marsh was a problem that good attorneys could not entirely solve. He had decided, for reasons that were perhaps purely pragmatic and perhaps something else, to cooperate fully. And cooperation fully given tends to change the shape of a case in ways that are difficult to argue around. By the end of April, the charges against Hale were formal: criminal conspiracy, procurement of poison with intent to harm, and several counts related to the fraudulent petition and the organized campaign to defame Evelyn's character. The Dunmore Land Company had quietly and officially severed its relationship with him, which was the financial version of what Hargrove had done when he'd left the ranch. The abandonment of a situation that had become more costly than it was worth. Hale's property was encumbered by the legal proceedings. His operations contracted. The men who worked for him were not all entirely certain anymore that the arrangement was a stable one, and some of them found other employment, and the gray horse that had stood at the Blackstone boundary line all winter was not seen there again. It was strange, Evelyn thought, how something that had felt enormous, the machinery of a powerful man's deliberate malice, could contract so quickly once its foundation was pulled. All that calculated patience, and all that money, and all those arrangements, and in the end it was undone by a druggist's memory, a piece of paper, a man in a boarding house in Hayden who'd done the arithmetic of loyalty and come out on the wrong side. She said something like this to Rosa one morning in late April, standing in the kitchen with the spring light finally coming strong through the window over the sink, and Rosa looked at her with the expression she had when she was going to say something precise and did not want to be misunderstood. Men like Hale, Rosa said, they build on other people. They make their plans out of the pieces of other people's willingness. And willingness runs out. She dried her hands on the dishcloth. That's the only thing you can count on with men like that. Eventually, they use up everyone willing to be used by them. Evelyn thought about this. It was true, she decided, and it was also true that Hale's plans had not simply collapsed on their own. They'd been dismantled actively by specific people. Cotter and Aldine, and the druggist who'd kept his records carefully, and Marsh, whose cooperation was morally complicated but practically essential. The willingness running out needed someone to notice when it ran out. "We noticed," she said. Rosa looked at her. "Yes," she said. "You did, among others." The warmth in that "we" was something Evelyn held on to for the rest of the day. Spring came to Blackstone Ranch with the gradual insistence that spring comes to high country. Not all at once, but in accumulations. A degree of temperature here, a week without new snow there. The first green at the edge of the south pasture where the ground stayed warmest. The sound of water moving under ice and then through mud and then freely in the creek that ran along the eastern boundary. The cattle grew restless and loud with the seasonal change. The hands were busy from before light. Wade came in for lunch one day in early May, smelling of horse and mud and spring air, and sat down at the kitchen table and ate the soup Evelyn had made without comment, which was usually a sign he was thinking about something. Abigail and Lucy were at the table too, Lucy working a geography problem and Abigail reading the natural history book, which had migrated from Evelyn's room to Abigail's, and Abigail had recently begun annotating it in small, careful pencil notes in the margins, which struck Evelyn as entirely appropriate. "The south fence section needs repair," Wade said, addressing nobody specific. "The spring thaw got under 2 of the posts." "Is it the same section as last fall?" Abigail asked, without looking up from the book. "Adjacent. The soil drains poorly there. You need to set the posts differently, or it'll keep happening." Wade looked at his older daughter with an expression Evelyn had come to love, which was the expression of a man repeatedly surprised and pleased by the competence of his children. "Is that right?" he said. "I read about it. In the farming almanac you have in your study." Abigail turned a page of her book. "The posts should go deeper and pack gravel around the base for drainage." "How long have you been reading my almanac?" "Since last summer. It was on the shelf and I ran out of other things." Wade looked at Evelyn, who looked at her soup. "She found the recipe books in the pantry too," Evelyn offered. "She's been copying things she wants to learn." "I have a notebook," Abigail confirmed, with the mildly defensive tone of someone who has been doing something quietly and is not entirely comfortable with it being made visible. "I know," Wade said. "I found it on the kitchen windowsill last week." "You read it?" "The cover, your name in private, in very emphatic letters." Abigail looked at him for a moment. Then, slowly, the way things move slowly with Abigail when they move towards warmth, she almost smiled. "It's not actually that private," she said. "It's mostly pie crust ratios." Lucy looked up from her geography. "Can I read it?"
No? Why not? Because it says private. But you just said it's the principal, Lucy.
Wade caught Evelyn's eye across the table. It was a brief look, 2 or 3 seconds, but it had in it something that the months of careful navigation had been building toward. The simple, uncomplicated recognition of 2 adults who are in the same place and are glad of it. Not complicated by anything unsaid, not freighted with what came next, just present and real and glad. She looked back at her soup. She was aware of warmth in her face that was not from the stove. It was the first week of May when the thing that had been growing between them became necessary to name. She didn't plan it, and she didn't see it coming, which was perhaps how it had to be given what she'd survived to get to it. They were in the barn, not together by arrangement. She'd come to check on a mare that had been off her feed for 2 days, and Wade was repairing a piece of tack in the back corner, and they'd started talking across the barn the way you talk when you're both working with your hands, and the conversation can be indirect. He'd been asking about the mare, and she'd been telling him what she'd observed, and somewhere in the middle of it he'd set down the tack and turned to look at her in a way that stopped the observation mid-sentence. "I want to ask you something," he said. She waited. "I've been trying to find the right time for a while now," he said, "and I've decided there probably isn't a right time, and I'm going to make one." He came toward her, not quickly, the way he moved when he was deliberate about something. He stopped about 3 feet away. I know what your position here is. I know what I said at the beginning about not looking for someone to replace Eleanor. I meant that. I still mean it." He paused. "But I also know what these months have been, what you've done for this place, for the girls." Another pause, longer. "For me." Evelyn held very still. "I'm not talking about the work," he said. "I'm not talking about the cooking, or the lessons, or the management of the house, though all of that." He stopped, frustrated in a way that was endearing because he was not often frustrated by the limits of his own language. "I'm talking about what you are, the person you are, the way you're in this place, the way the girls talk to you." He looked at her with the direct, unadorned quality she'd trusted from the beginning. "The way He stopped again. "The way you what?" she said, quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. "I don't want you to be here because I'm paying you," he said. "That's what I'm trying to say. I want you to be here because you want to be here." "I do want to be here," she said. "Then I'm asking if you want—" He stopped a final time, and something shifted in his face. The effort of a man dismantling the last of his carefully maintained reserve. "I'm asking if you might want to stay, permanently, as—" He seemed to know that the next word had to carry a lot, and was trying to find one that would hold it. "As family," he said. The barn was quiet, except for the mare shifting in her stall. The May light came through the gaps in the boards in long, slanted lines. She thought about the iron gate in November and the way she'd held on to the bars because her legs were not reliable. She thought about the burned cornbread and the pie crust and long division and the cold kitchen at dawn and a 13-year-old girl who hadn't wanted to laugh but had laughed anyway. She thought about Thomas, and she thought about Clara, and she thought about the locked room, and she thought about the fact that locked rooms were still rooms. They were yours. They were part of the house. They didn't stop existing when you built something new around them. "You're not a careful man with that word," she said. "Family is a large word." "I know what size it is," he said. "I'm not using it carelessly." She looked at him. This man who had opened a gate on a cold day because something in him had recognized something in her, and who had told her about Eleanor's ginger cake recipe and watched her bake it without flinching, and who had sat beside her bed through the night when she was sick, and who had stood beside her in that community hall while she said her daughter's name to a room full of strangers, and who had never once, not in any of it, made her feel like she was only what she'd arrived as. "I need to say something," she said. "All right. I'm not easy." She said it plainly, not as self-deprecation, but as information. "I'm stubborn, and I don't always say things when I should, and I carry things I should put down, and I have a great deal of grief that isn't finished and won't be finished for a long time." She paused. "I'm telling you that because I don't want you to be surprised by it later." "I've been watching you for 6 months," he said. "I know what I'm asking." She held his gaze. "Ask me properly then," she said. He almost smiled, the contained, reluctant, near smile that was the most unguarded thing about him. Then he said simply and without theater, "Will you stay, Evelyn? Will you be part of this family?" She thought about the gate. She thought about nowhere to move along to. She thought, this is somewhere. "Yes," she said, "I will." The days that followed had the particular quality of something that has shifted on its foundation and is settling into its new position. Not chaotic, not dramatic, just the steady internal rearrangement of a thing that has changed. She told Rosa first, because that was right, and Rosa looked at her for a long moment and said, "I know," in a tone that suggested she had known for considerably longer than Evelyn had. "Was it obvious?" Evelyn asked. "To someone paying attention." Rosa returned to what she was doing. "Abigail will take time." "I know." "Lucy will be—" "I know that too." Rosa glanced at her. "You're not worried about them." "I'm worried about doing right by them. That's different from being worried about them." Evelyn picked up the dishcloth. "They're good girls who've been through hard things. That doesn't change. I'm not trying to change it." "No," Rosa said. "You've never tried to change what's true. That's why it works." They told the girls together, Wade and Evelyn, at the kitchen table after supper on a Thursday evening. Wade said it plainly, that he had asked Evelyn to become a permanent part of the family, and that she had agreed, and that nothing about this was meant to replace or diminish what had come before, but that he hoped they could see it as something being added rather than something being replaced. Abigail listened to this with her arms folded and her face doing its careful management. When Wade finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to get married?" "In time, yes, if that's what everyone wants." Another silence. Evelyn watched Abigail work through it, the way she'd learned to watch her work through things. The visible processing, the invisible weighing. "What does permanent mean exactly?" Abigail asked. "For you." She looked at Evelyn directly. "It means I'm not leaving," Evelyn said. "It means this is my home." "Even if things are hard?" "I've had hard. I know the difference between hard and wrong." She held Abigail's gaze. "This isn't wrong." Abigail unfolded her arms. She looked at the table, then back up. "All right," she said, not warmly, not with the openness that would come later and would come fully, but with the weight of a considered decision. "All right." Lucy had been watching all of this with an expression that Evelyn had not seen on her before. Something that was trying very hard not to be what it was, which was hope of the vulnerable kind, the kind you try to keep your face away from because being seen to hope makes you exposed. "Lucy," Evelyn said, "do you want to say something?" Lucy looked at her. The trying not to hope expression held for another second. Then it gave way, the way faces give way when you stop asking them to hold something in. "Are you going to be our mother?" she asked. The word was barely audible. The kitchen was very quiet. Evelyn felt something move in her chest that she was not going to let herself cry about at this table, not right now. She took a breath. "I'm going to be here," she said. "Every day, whatever you need me to be." She paused. "What that's called is up to you." Lucy thought about this for a moment. Then she got up from her chair and came around the table and sat down again. On the bench beside Evelyn, close, which was the most deliberate and the most costly thing she had done. The 9-year-old who had decided somewhere in December that she would not let anyone new in and had been letting someone new in every single day since. She didn't say anything else. She just sat there. Evelyn did not reach over and pull her close, because that was not the right moment for that. The moment had to be Lucy's, not hers. She just sat beside the girl and let the sitting be what it was. Wade looked at her from across the table. He was not a man who showed everything on his face, but some things were too large for even his particular containment. She held his gaze and nodded, once, and that was enough. Outside, the May evening had gone golden and long, and the cattle moved in the south pasture, and the creek ran free along the eastern fence, and Blackstone Ranch went on about its life, which was now also, finally and without equivocation, hers. The summer that followed was the hardest kind of good, meaning it was full of work and heat and the 1,000 daily demands of a working ranch in Colorado, and it was also, underneath all of that, something Evelyn had stopped believing she would have again. She and Wade did not rush anything. That was perhaps the first decision they made together without discussing it. Simply the shared understanding that what they were building needed to be built at the pace of the people living in it, not at the pace of sentiment or urgency, or what other people thought was appropriate. There had been enough of other people's opinions about Evelyn Hartwell to last several lifetimes, and neither of them had any interest in performing their life for an audience. Abigail knew this. She watched the way things moved in the house with the careful attention she brought to everything, and she did not push and she did not obstruct. And somewhere around July, she came into the kitchen on a Saturday morning for baking and sat down at the counter and said, without preamble, "You make him less serious." Evelyn looked up from the dough she was working. "Your father? He used to be very serious all the time. Even when he was trying not to be, you could feel the serious underneath." Abigail picked up the rolling pin and turned it in her hands. "Now it's less heavy. In him. I don't know how else to say it." "I think he's made himself less heavy," Evelyn said. "That's not something I did." Abigail considered this. "Maybe," she said, "but you being here gave him something to be less heavy for." She set the rolling pin down. "I'm not saying that's your job. I'm saying I'm glad." It was the closest Abigail had come in all these months to saying thank you for the thing that was hardest to say thank you for. Evelyn received it without making too much of it, which was the only right way to receive it, and handed her the rolling pin. "The dough's ready," she said. "Don't overwork it." Abigail took the rolling pin with something that was finally and clearly a full smile. "I know," she said, "cold butter." Lucy, for her part, had arrived at her own terms with the new shape of things, which were predictably unconventional. She had not started calling Evelyn anything other than her name, not yet, maybe not ever, and that was entirely acceptable. But she had developed the habit of appearing wherever Evelyn was when she had something to think through, which happened to be most of the time given that Lucy's mind produced things to think through at a prolific rate. She would sit nearby and work on something, a drawing, a geography problem, a piece of string she was fashioning into increasingly complicated knots, and talk while she worked, and Evelyn would listen and answer and not try to direct anything, and Lucy seemed to find this arrangement exactly right. In August, Lucy showed her a drawing she'd been working on for 3 weeks. It was a picture of the ranch, the main house, the stable, the cottonwood trees, the mountains behind, and it had 5 figures in front of the house. She had labeled them. Rosa was there. Wade, Abigail, Lucy herself, identifiable by the braid she'd started wearing in May. The 5th figure was labeled, in Lucy's careful 8-year-old handwriting, she had turned 10 in June, E, just the initial, as if she wasn't quite ready to write the whole thing out but needed it on the page. Evelyn looked at the drawing for a moment without speaking. "It's for the parlor," Lucy said, studying a knot in her string. "If you want it there." "I'd like that very much," Evelyn said. The drawing went on the parlor wall next to a photograph of Eleanor that had always been there. Nobody made a comment about the placement. It was simply where it went. Victor Hale's trial concluded in September, in the county seat at Hayden, and Evelyn was not there for most of it. Wade attended the key days and reported back with the particular factual economy of a man who wanted her to have the information without having to relive the performance. Silas Marsh had testified in full, and the druggist from Hayden had confirmed his account, and Hale's attorneys had done what good attorneys do when the evidence is solid. They had argued around the edges and questioned the methodology and suggested alternative interpretations, and ultimately could not make the central facts mean something they didn't mean. Hale was convicted on 3 counts. The sentencing was not severe by the standards Evelyn might have wished, 4 years with the possibility of reduction, but it was enough. It was enough to make the thing real, to put a formal name on what had been done and impose a consequence on the person who had done it. Wade told her the number and she sat with it for a moment and said, "All right," and meant it. "You're not angry?" he asked. "I was angry for months," she said. "I don't have the energy to stay angry at a sentence. He's convicted. He'll carry that." She paused. "And his land isn't going anywhere. Hale's property is tied up in legal proceedings for years. Nobody's doing to this valley what he planned to do to it." She looked at Wade. "That's the part that mattered." He looked at her for a long moment. "You know what Eleanor would have said about you?" he said. Evelyn raised an eyebrow. "She'd have said you were too practical for your own good." A pause, and there was real warmth in his voice.
the warmth of a man who can speak his dead wife's name with love rather than only grief. And then she'd have said she meant it as a compliment. It sounds like a compliment the way you tell it, Evelyn said. She was usually right, he said, about most things.
Evelyn nodded. They had arrived, over these months, at the particular place where the past could be spoken of honestly, where Eleanor was not a wound or a complication, but a real person who had been here and mattered and was still present in the house in the ways that people remain present, in the recipe written on paper, in the way Abigail held her chin when she was thinking, in the photograph on the parlor wall, in the ginger cake made every Christmas Eve. Evelyn had not displaced that presence. She'd learned to live alongside it, which was a different thing, and she thought the more honest thing. They were married on Christmas Eve. This was not a grand decision so much as a right one. The date had offered itself and made a kind of sense that was bigger than either of them. The ceremony was small, held at the ranch rather than in town, which suited them both. Rosa was there. Sheriff Aldine came, which was his own kind of statement. Cotter came with his wife, a quiet woman named Margaret, who had sharp eyes and a kind mouth, and who pressed Evelyn's hand on arriving and said nothing, and thereby said everything. A few of the ranch hands stood at the back in their good shirts. The parlor was full of firelight, and the smell of pine from the branches that Lucy and Abigail had cut and arranged along the mantelpiece, which they'd done together with an intensity of purpose that suggested they'd been planning it longer than they'd let on. The justice of the peace from Harrow Creek performed the ceremony. It was brief and plain, and neither of them wanted it any other way. When it was done, and the room made the sounds that rooms make when a thing has been settled, Abigail came to stand beside Evelyn with her arms at her sides and her face working at something. "I've been thinking about what to call you," she said, quietly enough that it was between them. Evelyn waited. "I don't know yet," Abigail said. "I want you to know I'm thinking about it, not because it's difficult, because I want to get it right." "Take as long as you need," Evelyn said. Abigail nodded. Then she did something she had never done without being reached for first. She stepped forward and hugged Evelyn, briefly and fiercely, and then stepped back and went to go talk to Rosa with the slightly increased pace of someone who has done a vulnerable thing and is not going to stand around in the aftermath of it. Evelyn pressed her hand flat against her sternum for a moment, quietly, where nobody could see. Lucy appeared from behind the parlor door where she'd apparently been waiting for Abigail to finish. "My turn," she said. Evelyn laughed. A real laugh, startled out of her. Lucy stepped forward and put her arms around her with the direct, uncomplicated physicality of a child who has made a decision and is committed to it, and Evelyn put her arms around the girl and held on. "Merry Christmas," Lucy said, muffled against her shoulder. "Merry Christmas," Evelyn said. Wade found her on the back porch an hour later when the house was full of voices and the smell of food and the ordinary miracle of people gathered together for no better reason than that they wanted to be. He stood beside her the way he'd stood beside her on that first dark porch in May, and the mountains were white in the winter moonlight, and the cattle were settled, and the ranch was quiet and awake at the same time, the way it always was. "You're cold," he said. "I wanted a minute." He took off his coat and put it over her shoulders without asking, which she would have objected to if it hadn't been so exactly right. She pulled it around herself. "How are you?" he asked. She thought about this honestly, which was the only way she'd learned to think about things that mattered. "I'm all right," she said. "I'm more than all right." She paused. "I'm something I don't have the right word for." "Whole," he said, and then seemed uncertain whether he'd overreached. She thought about it. "Not quite whole," she said, because honesty required accuracy. "There are pieces I'm not going to get back, but full. Full of the things that are still here." He put his arm around her and she let herself lean into it, which was an act of trust that was still, even now, not entirely easy, because the body remembers what it has been through even when the mind has made peace with it. But she leaned in, and the weight of him beside her was solid and real and present, and the mountains were white and enormous in the dark. "She'd have liked you," he said quietly. "Eleanor." She was suspicious of competent people at first. She always said they were usually hiding something. But then she'd figure out they weren't hiding anything. They just worked hard, and she'd completely reverse. A pause. She reversed quickly on people she liked. She'd have reversed on you by the second week. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. I think I'd have liked her, she said. She bossed me terribly, he said, with the warmth of someone speaking a beloved truth. Someone had to. He made the sound that was almost a laugh. She'd come to love that sound. The near laugh that was more honest than most people's full ones. The sound of a man who had been serious for a long time and was relearning how to be otherwise. They stood on the porch until the cold made it impractical, and then they went back inside to the warmth and the noise and the life of it, which was theirs. The school was Abigail's idea. This was important. That was how Evelyn always told it afterward, when the telling came up. It was Abigail's idea, not hers. She had not arrived at Blackstone Ranch with any plan to build anything beyond a way to survive the winter, and the school was not something she'd imagined, and certainly not something she could have brought about alone. It came from Abigail, who in the spring after the wedding had been working with the natural history book and her recipe notebook and the arithmetic lessons and the novels they read together, and who had said one morning, with the directness that was her particular brand of love, "There are children in this valley with nothing." What kind of nothing? Evelyn asked. The kind I had before you came, Abigail said. No teacher, no lessons, no one who thought it mattered. She paused. It matters. Evelyn looked at her 14-year-old stepdaughter, who had said what she felt in exactly the right words without apparent effort, and thought about cold butter and pie crust and the piece of a broken ruler that had been holding a window shut when she arrived. Yes, she said. It does. She brought it to Wade that evening as Abigail's idea, attributed to its source. He listened and was quiet for a moment and then said, The old bunkhouse has been empty since we reduced the hands last fall. It's got a floor and a stove and 4 good walls. It would need furniture, proper lights. What else? Someone to teach. He looked at her. She looked back at him. I'm not a trained teacher, she said. You've been teaching my daughters for a year and a half. That's different. Is it? She thought about Lucy and long division and the green notebook and the piece of broken ruler. She thought about what it was to have been a child with no one who thought your mind was worth the trouble. Not entirely, she said. The old bunkhouse was converted over the spring. The ranch hands built desks out of salvaged wood, which were rough but serviceable. Rosa contributed 2 kerosene lamps from the house. Cotter came out one Saturday with his son and helped install shelving. Mrs. Garfield from the millinery sent over 4 bolts of cloth for curtains, unprompted and with a note that said simply, good work. The school opened in September with 11 children, ranging in age from 6 to 13, from 3 Valley families who had heard about the project through the particular rural telegraph of neighbors who talk at supply runs, and church gatherings and chance meetings on the road. By October, there were 15 children. By November, a woman named Frances, who had taught in Indiana before her husband had brought her west, and who had been applying her training to her own 3 children for 2 years, sent a letter asking if she could come and teach formally 2 days a week. Evelyn wrote back the same day. She taught herself on the other 3 days, in the mornings before the household work, and she was not a polished teacher and she made mistakes, stumbled over explanations, misjudged what was too easy or too hard, sometimes lost the thread of a lesson and had to backtrack, which was embarrassing with 15 faces watching you. But she kept going because that was the only mechanism available. You kept going and you got less wrong over time, and the getting less wrong was its own education. Abigail came on Saturdays to help with the older children's reading. This had not been asked of her. She had simply appeared the second Saturday with her own books and an expression that dared anyone to comment on it. Nobody did. Lucy came occasionally and disrupted things enthusiastically and had to be redirected, which she accepted with variable grace. The younger children found her fascinating, which Lucy bore with great dignity. There was a morning in December, the December that marked 1 full year since Evelyn had arrived at the Iron Gate, when she sat in the converted bunkhouse before the children arrived and looked at the room. The shelves were full, not overflowing, not lavish, but full. Books that had come from various directions over the months, donated and purchased and borrowed, and in some cases, hand-copied by Abigail when the actual text was too expensive. The curtains from Mrs. Garfield's cloth were blue, and the morning light came through them in a way that made the room look warmer than it was. There was a map on the wall that one of the fathers had brought back from a trip to Denver, showing the full territory of Colorado and the country beyond. Lucy had added pencil marks to it at various points. labeling mountains and rivers with a confident authority that bore only a loose relationship to accuracy. Evelyn sat in the teacher's chair with her hands around a cup of coffee and looked at the map and the pencil marks in the imperfect shelves and felt something she had learned to name, carefully and without oversimplification, because she was a person who had learned the cost of calling something what it wasn't before you were sure. This was not a happy ending. She had been clear on that in her own mind, in the way that people who have lost children and husbands and homes are clear on the difference between an ending and a continuation. Clara was still gone. Thomas was still gone. Iowa was still a burned field in her memory that she would carry until she didn't have to carry anything anymore. Those losses had not been repaired. They had been accommodated, incorporated into the structure of a life that had kept building around them, the way a tree grows around a nail until the nail is part of the tree. What she had was not the absence of loss. It was a life full enough to contain the loss without being only the loss. That was the thing she wished she could have told herself at the gate. Not that it would be better. She hadn't known then if better was a word that still applied to her, but that it would be full. That she would be full again with different things than before, but real things. Things that required her and that she was required by. Things that would be damaged by her absence, which is another way of saying things that she was genuinely part of. The children arrived at 8:30. They came in the way children arrive everywhere, in groups and individually, loud and quiet, dragging their reluctance or running ahead of it, smelling of cold and breakfast and the particular outdoor smell of Colorado winter. They hung their coats and found their seats, and the room became what it became every morning, which was a room where 15 now, 16 with Francis's children, where 16 young people were expected to use their minds, and mostly did, in the imperfect and effortful way that people use their minds when someone has communicated to them that their minds are worth the effort. She called them to attention. She wrote something on the board. A child in the second row asked a question that had nothing to do with the lesson, and she answered it anyway. And another child immediately asked a follow-up question that was actually relevant, and the morning assembled itself from there. This was not a dramatic thing. There was no audience and no applause, and no particular marking of the moment. It was just a Tuesday. But the truth about most important things is that they happen on Tuesdays. They happen in kitchens and on back porches, and in converted bunkhouses, and in small exchanges over bread dough and long division and the proper technique for pie crust. They happen in the accumulation of ordinary days that each contain, somewhere inside them, the decision to keep going and to mean something by it. Evelyn had arrived at Blackstone Ranch with 2 dresses and a traveling bag and a sewing kit and the ability to cook. She had arrived in November with nothing that she would have described as a future, only the mechanism of the next few hours, the animal persistence of a person who has not yet completely given up, even though she was not certain why. She had not fixed anything that was broken in her by being here. She wanted to be clear about that, at least to herself. She was still a woman who locked certain rooms and sometimes flinched at specific kinds of silence and had grief that resurfaced at unpredictable moments and occasionally stood at windows longer than she meant to. She had not been rescued from herself. She had not been completed by someone else's love, because she had been complete the whole time, damaged and grieving and exhausted, but complete. What had happened was something different. What had happened was that she had been seen, accurately, without softening the difficult parts, by a man at a gate who had looked at her and seen past the torn coat to something that was still there, still intact, still capable of more than surviving. And once seen clearly, even imperfectly, by even one person at the right moment, you could start to see yourself that way again. That was the thing, she thought, the thing that mattered and that was hardest to articulate and that she thought about sometimes when she was trying to understand what had happened to her in this year. People need to be seen, not as what they've lost or what they've failed at or what they can't prove about themselves in a room full of strangers. Seen as what they actually are, imperfect and capable and carrying things and still here. When that happens for a person who has stopped expecting it, something comes loose in them that makes more possible. Not easy. Possible. She thought about this because she tried to do it for the children in this room. She tried to see them, each of them, in the specific and unromanticized way that someone had seen her at a gate in November. She was not always successful. She misjudged them sometimes, had off days, lost patience in ways she wasn't proud of, fell back on habit when she should have thought harder. She was not a perfect teacher any more than she was a perfect person. But she tried, every Tuesday, to see them. The Christmas Eve that marked 1 year came with snow, which was the only meteorologically correct way for it to arrive. The ginger cake was in the oven. The smell had reached every room of the house by early afternoon, which was also correct. Lucy had her nose aimed at the kitchen door every 20 minutes and had been told firmly twice that the cake would be ready when it was ready and not 1 minute before, to which she had responded the second time that knowing when something would be ready was precisely the purpose of a clock, which was the kind of observation you couldn't entirely argue with. Abigail was at the kitchen table writing something in her notebook. She had recently begun writing things that were not recipe notes or lesson materials. She'd shown Evelyn a paragraph the previous week, tentatively, with the expression of someone not sure if what they were showing was foolish, and it had been a description of the south pasture in morning light that was careful and true and needed very little that Evelyn could see, except perhaps more of itself. "It's good," Evelyn had said. "It's incomplete." "That's different from not being good." Evelyn had handed the notebook back. "Keep going." Wade came in from the yard, stamping snow off his boots, and looked at the kitchen and the cake and the daughters and his wife by the stove, and stood in the doorway for a moment with his coat still on. "Don't just stand there," Evelyn said. "You're letting the cold in." He came in and shut the door and hung his coat up and came to the kitchen table and sat down. And Lucy immediately materialized beside him to report on the situation with the cake, and Abigail looked up from her notebook to say something about the fence section he'd been planning to repair before the snow. And Wade answered them both, and asked Evelyn without turning around whether the broth she'd started that morning was ready yet, because he'd been in the cold since dawn, and would consider a small bowl a significant improvement in circumstances. "Almost," she said. "Almost is not the same as yes. I'm aware of that. I went to the same school as you." "We didn't go to the same school," he said. "We're the same age." "We went to the same school of life, which is the one that matters, and which teaches everyone mostly the same things at different rates." Lucy looked between them. "That doesn't make sense," she said. "It will," Evelyn said, "in about 20 years. "I'll write it down so I remember to figure it out," Lucy said, with complete seriousness, and went to get a piece of paper. Abigail made a sound that was a full laugh, the kind she'd been more willing to produce this year, the kind that didn't seem to surprise her anymore. Wade caught Evelyn's eye across the kitchen, and the look between them had everything in it and asked for nothing back, which was the particular quality of looks between people who have been through enough that they've stopped needing to make everything explicit. The broth was ready. The cake needed another 20 minutes. Outside, the snow came down over the mountains and the pastures and the cottonwood trees and the old bunkhouse and the iron gates at the road, coming down equally on everything the way snow does, without preference, covering the worn parts and the good parts in the same white. Evelyn stood at the stove and looked out the window over the sink at the yard filling with white, and she thought about November, about cold hands on iron bars, about the young man who'd told her to move along and the man who'd opened the gate instead. She thought, "That woman is still me. I haven't left her behind. I brought her here." This was the thing she knew now that she hadn't known then. Not that survival would turn into something better. Not that grief would transform into joy. Not that loss would be made up for by gain. But that the self you are in the worst of it is the same self you are in the best of it. You don't become someone else when the circumstances change. You just become more visible to yourself and to the people who look at you carefully enough. She had been visible, finally, to people who looked carefully enough. It was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything. The cake came out of the oven at the right time, which was a small mercy, and also not entirely surprising, because she'd made it 3 times now and knew its particular requirements. She set it on the rack, and Lucy appeared instantly at her elbow to observe the process with scientific focus, and Abigail closed her notebook and came to stand on her other side. And Wade poured coffee without being asked and brought her a cup, and the kitchen was warm and full and imperfect and alive. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the fire held. That was enough. That was in the particular arithmetic of a life actually lived rather than imagined, more than enough. It was, to use the word she'd finally settled on after a year of looking for the right one, it was home.